Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's darkest corners, a place where the line between healing and horror blurred so completely that its very name became synonymous with chaos. Imagine a grand palace in the heart of London, its facade rivaling Versailles itself, where wealthy citizens paid admission to watch human beings chained to walls, spinning in torture devices and screaming through iron bars. This was not a prison for criminals. This was medicine. This was Bedlam. Now, before we step through those iron gates together, I want to ask you something. If you are already enjoying the way this story is unfolding, would you take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button? And I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now as you listen? Are you tucked into bed in New York? Driving through the night in California? Wherever you are, drop a comment below and let me know. I love hearing from you. All right, dim those lights, let the world outside fade away, and let us walk together into the shadows of Victorian England. The year is 1247. King Henry III sits on the throne of England, and in a small plot of land just outside the ancient walls of London near a gate called Bishopsgate, a modest priory is being established. It is called the Priory of the New Order of Our Lady of Bethlehem. The name is beautiful, is it not? Bethlehem, the birthplace of Christ, a symbol of hope and sanctuary. An Italian bishop named Goffredo de Perfetti, along with a generous London alderman named Simon Fitzmary, founded this place as a collection centre, a monastery to support the Crusades happening far away in the Holy Land. It was meant to be a place of charity, of refuge. But history has a way of twisting intentions. Somewhere in the fog of the next century and a half, this priory began to accept a different kind of visitor. By the year 1403, records show that 6 men were living there, described in Latin as mente capti, literally those whose minds have been captured, the insane. And so, almost by accident, Europe's first mental health institution was born, not through grand medical vision or scientific breakthrough, but through the simple, desperate reality that someone had to do something with people whose minds had broken. The English, with their tendency to shorten and slur their words, began calling it Bethlehem. Then, as decades rolled into centuries, that name warped and twisted in the mouths of Londoners until it became something else entirely, Bedlam. By the 1600s, that word, Bedlam, had already escaped the walls of the hospital and entered the English language itself. When you said something was absolute bedlam, everyone knew exactly what you meant. Chaos, confusion, madness, uproar. The place had become so notorious that its nickname became the definition of disorder itself. Now let me paint you a picture of what was happening inside those walls, because this is where our story takes a turn that might make you pull your blanket a little tighter. In 1618, a physician named Helkiah Crooke managed to get himself appointed as the keeper of Bedlam. He had connections, close ties to King James I, and he actually tried to help. Crooke looked at the conditions, at the suffering, and he went directly to the crown, asking for more money, more resources. He advocated for the residents. He saw them as human beings who deserved care. But Crooke clashed with the Board of Governors. These were the wealthy men who oversaw the hospital, and they did not appreciate his interference. When King James died in 1625, Crooke lost his royal protection, and he was promptly removed from his position. That dismissal marked the beginning of 200 years of horror. 2 centuries. Think about that timeline. From 1625 to 1815, the people confined in Bedlam experienced treatment that would make your stomach turn. They were starved. Not because there was no food, but because feeding them properly was expensive and inconvenient. They were beaten by staff who saw them as less than human. They were subjected to what doctors called medical treatments, bloodletting, where they would open a vein and drain pints of blood because they believed madness lived in the blood itself. They were given emetics to make them vomit violently, because purging the body would supposedly purge the mind, and this was considered cutting-edge medicine. But here is where the story becomes truly chilling. In 1675, the old Bedlam building was falling apart, literally crumbling. So the City of London decided to build a new one, and they did not hold back. The new Bethlem Hospital, built in an area called Moorfields, was magnificent. Imagine approaching it from a distance. You would see a building that stretched over 500 feet wide with beautiful gardens, manicured lawns, and trees lining the entrance. The architecture was compared to the Palace of Versailles by Londoners who saw it. This was not a hospital. This was a statement. This was power and wealth on display. At the entrance gate stood two massive statues, commissioned specifically for this building. One was called Melancholy, showing a figure slumped in depression. The other was Raving, depicting someone in the throes of violent mania. These statues were meant to represent the two faces of mental illness, the twin conditions that the hospital claimed to treat. They were hauntingly beautiful and deeply disturbing at the same time, works of art that advertised the human suffering contained within. But here is what they did not tell you when you looked at that impressive facade. The building had been constructed on unstable ground. When it rained, water ran down the interior walls. The foundation was literally unsound, a perfect metaphor for everything that was wrong with the institution itself. Beautiful on the outside, rotten at the core, and the most disturbing part, Bedlam became a tourist attraction. I need you to understand what I'm saying here, because it sounds impossible, but it is documented historical fact. Starting as early as 1598 and continuing for nearly 200 years, the governors of Bethlem Hospital opened the doors to paying visitors, not family members coming to see their loved ones, though that happened too. No, these were curiosity seekers, wealthy Londoners, educated people, members of high society. They would pay money, good money, to walk through the wards and stare at the patients. The hospital governors justified this in their records. They needed funding, they said. The Crown was not giving them enough money. Charitable donations were insufficient. So why not turn human suffering into entertainment? Why not make the mad perform for their supper? And perform they did. Nurses would parade certain patients in front of visitors, making them act out their symptoms, their delusions, their pain. Imagine being trapped in your own mind, confused and terrified, and then being forced to dance like a circus animal for strangers who laughed at you. By the 1750s, Bethlem was one of the top tourist attractions in all of London. Some historians estimate that at its peak, the hospital received 96,000 visitors per year. Let that number sink in. 96,000 people paying admission to gawk at human beings in cages. More people visited Bedlam annually than visited most of London's famous landmarks. It was right there on the tourist itinerary, next to the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey. Oh, and after we see the crown jewels, shall we pop over to Bedlam and laugh at the lunatics? The visitors did not just watch, they taunted. They threw things. They poked at patients through bars. Some brought their children along as if it were an educational outing. See, little Timothy, this is what happens when you give in to wickedness and sin. This is what madness looks like. The patients had no privacy, no dignity, no escape. They were human zoo animals, and their suffering was profitable. But let me tell you about one man whose story eventually helped change everything. His name was James Norris. and his case would become the symbol of everything wrong with Bedlam. James was an American seaman who ended up confined in Bethlehem Hospital. We do not know exactly what brought him there or what his original condition was. What we do know is what happened to him next. For 12 years, 12 entire years, James Norris was kept in restraints. But these were not simple chains. What they did to this man was so elaborate, so meticulously cruel, that when it was finally described to the public, it shocked even a society that had grown numb to suffering. Around his neck they riveted an iron collar. From that collar, chains ran to an iron bar that was bolted to the wall behind him. Around his body they fitted a strong iron bar about 2 inches wide. On each side of this bar were circular projections that enclosed his arms, pinning them against his sides. This waist bar was secured by 2 more iron bars that passed over his shoulders and were riveted to the bar at his waist, both in front and behind. From these shoulder bars, short chains connected back to the ring on the wall. Picture it. James Norris could not move his arms. He could not lie down fully. He could barely shift position. The metal dug into his skin day and night. He could not scratch an itch on his face, could not adjust when his legs cramped, could not embrace himself for comfort when the darkness closed in. 12 years. He could not even turn around to see the wall he was chained to. Why was he restrained like this? The official records say he was difficult to manage. He probably fought back when they tried to hurt him. He probably screamed when the conditions became unbearable. So they made it impossible for him to do anything at all. And for over a decade, James Norris lived in that iron cage, attached to a wall in Bedlam, while 96,000 visitors per year walked past and stared. But in 1814, something shifted. A man named Edward Wakefield, a Quaker land agent and advocate for reform, visited Bethlehem several times during the late spring and early summer. Wakefield was not there for entertainment. He was there to investigate, to document, to bear witness. And when he saw James Norris, when he saw the elaborate torture device that had become this man's entire existence, Wakefield was horrified. He took careful notes. He described every detail of those restraints. And then he went public. Wakefield wrote about what he saw. Newspapers picked up the story. The public, who had been content to visit Bedlam for fun, suddenly felt uncomfortable when confronted with the specific, detailed reality of what their entertainment actually meant. In 1815, the British House of Commons established a select committee on madhouses. They launched a formal parliamentary inquiry into the conditions at Bethlehem and other asylums. The testimony was damning. The committee discovered that the hospital's principal physician, a man named Thomas Monroe, was described in official findings as wanting in humanity toward his patients. That is British understatement for you. Wanting in humanity meant he was cruel, negligent, and abusive. Monroe was forced to resign, though he never faced criminal charges. The scandal rocked London society. Suddenly, the amusement park of madness did not seem so amusing anymore. The 1815 inquiry marked the beginning, just the beginning, of what would eventually become a massive reform movement in mental health care. But change came slowly, painfully slowly, because the whole system was built on attitudes that went back centuries. The idea that mad people were less than human, the belief that mental illness was a moral failing, a punishment from God, or a sign of demonic possession. The assumption that people who could not control their own minds had no rights, no voice, no claim to dignity. And here is what makes this even more complicated. Bedlam really did start with good intentions. Remember, it began as a priory, a religious house meant to provide sanctuary. The very word asylum means refuge, a safe place. Somewhere along the way, between the idealism and the reality, between the theory and the practice, that mission got lost. Sanctuary became imprisonment, refuge became torture, healing became horror. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to think about those iron statues at the entrance of the Moorfields building, melancholy and raving, frozen in stone, advertising the pain within. Think about James Norris, chained to a wall for 12 years while the world walked past. Think about the word Bedlam itself, how a name that meant Bethlehem, the birthplace of hope, became a synonym for chaos and madness. Because what happened at Bedlam was not an accident. It was not the work of a few cruel individuals. It was a system, a culture, a society-wide failure to see the humanity in people whose minds work differently. And that legacy, those shadows, stretch further than you might think. The ghosts of Bedlam still walk through our modern world in ways we will explore together in the coming parts of this story. But we've only just begun. We have seen the foundation, the origin story, the palace of madness that gave the Victorian era its darkest institutions. Next, we need to understand how this horror spread across an entire nation, how Britain built what historians call its mental empire, constructing over 100 asylums in less than a century and confining more than 150,000 souls behind their walls. We will meet the reformers who fought to change the system, the doctors who believed in kindness, and the patients whose voices were nearly lost to history. Stay with me, because this story gets deeper, darker, and ultimately more hopeful than you might expect. Rest well tonight, and I will see you in the next part of our journey. The scandal at Bedlam sent shockwaves through British society. But here is what most people do not realise. While London was reeling from the revelations about one infamous hospital, something far larger was already happening across the entire nation. Between the early 1800s and the turn of the 20th century, Britain embarked on what historians now call the Great Confinement, a systematic government-mandated construction of mental asylums on a scale the world had never seen. And the numbers are staggering. Picture this. In the year 1800, England had maybe a handful of institutions dedicated to housing the mentally ill. By 1890, there were over 60 county asylums. By the 1950s, that number had exploded to more than 100 facilities, holding approximately 150,000 patients. Think about that. In just over a century, an entire infrastructure of institutional confinement was built, brick by brick, ward by ward across the English countryside. This was not organic growth. This was policy. This was law. And it all started with a single piece of legislation that changed everything. The year was 1808. Parliament passed something called the County Asylums Act, and it carried a simple but revolutionary mandate. Every county in England was encouraged, strongly encouraged, to build a lunatic asylum to house what they called pauper lunatics. These were mentally ill people who had no money, no family support, no means to pay for private care. Before this act, these individuals ended up in workhouses, which were essentially labour camps for the poor, or in prisons alongside criminals. Sometimes they just wandered the streets until they died or disappeared. The 1808 Act said, in effect, this is a problem, and counties need to solve it. But here is the thing about encouraging local governments to spend money. It does not always work. The response to the 1808 Act was slow, hesitant. Counties dragged their feet. Building an asylum was expensive. It required land, materials, staff, ongoing funding. Many justices of the peace, the local officials responsible for making this happen, simply chose to ignore the law. After all, it was only encouragement, not compulsion. So mentally ill paupers continued to rot in prisons as workhouses, and the cycle of neglect continued. Then came 1845, and everything changed. Parliament passed 2 new laws that same year, the Lunacy Act and the County Asylums Act of 1845. And this time, there was no wiggle room. The law was clear. Every county must build and maintain a public asylum. Not encouraged, not suggested. Must. Mandatory. Suddenly, counties across England found themselves legally obligated to construct these massive institutions, and they did. The building boom was extraordinary. Between 1845 and 1890, over 60 new asylums were erected. After that, another 40 followed. Each one was designed to hold hundreds, sometimes thousands of patients. The architecture was deliberate, carefully planned to convey specific messages. These were not prisons, the designers insisted. These were places of healing, of hope, of modern scientific medicine. So they built them to look like grand country estates with sprawling grounds, ornamental gardens, cricket fields, and impressive facades. They wanted the public to see progress, to see civilization triumphing over madness. But let me tell you what else these asylums conveyed, perhaps unintentionally. They were placed on the edges of towns, just far enough from the city centres that you could forget they were there. Out of sight, out of mind. The long tree-lined driveways created distance, both physical and psychological, between the normal world and the world of the insane. The high walls and imposing gates said, "What happens here stays here." And the sheer size of these buildings, enormous, often 3 or 4 stories high, stretching hundreds of feet in length, made anyone approaching them feel small, insignificant, powerless. Now let us talk about how someone actually ended up inside one of these asylums, because the process reveals so much about Victorian society. Under the amended laws of 1853, a system was put in place that sounds reasonable on paper, but was terrifying in practice. Each parish had a medical officer, a local doctor, who was required to visit all paupers in his area 4 times a year. 4 times. That is once every 3 months. During these visits, he was supposed to identify anyone who seemed to need mental treatment. If the doctor believed someone was insane, he would notify the guardians or overseers of the poor. Then came the certification process. To legally detain someone as a pauper lunatic, you needed 2 things: a medical certificate signed by the parish medical officer and approval from the local justice of the peace. 2 signatures, and a person could be locked away, potentially for the rest of their life. No trial, no defense attorney, no appeal process, just a doctor's opinion and a judge's stamp. And here is where it gets really interesting. What did insane mean in Victorian England? The definitions were shockingly broad, and often had more to do with social control than actual mental illness. Were you a woman who talked back to your husband? Insane. Were you a poor person who could not hold down a job because of physical exhaustion? Insane. Were you an immigrant who did not speak English and could not explain yourself to the authorities? Definitely insane. Did you drink too much? Did you have what we would now call postpartum depression? Did you have seizures that people thought were demonic possession? Into the asylum you went. Let me give you some real numbers from a specific asylum to show you how this worked. In Cornwall, in the southwest of England, there was a typical county asylum called St. Lawrence's Hospital. Between 1870 and 1875, they admitted 511 patients. All of them were classified as paupers, people whose admission was paid for by public funds. Researchers went through the admission registers years later, and what they found is fascinating. Of those 511 admissions, about 70% of the patients diagnosed with mania were admitted within 2 months of their symptoms first appearing. 2 months. That seems incredibly fast, does it not? Compare that to the 51% of dementia patients and 55% of melancholia patients admitted within the same time frame. What this tells us is that Victorian society was terrified of mania, of wild, unpredictable behavior, of people who were loud and disruptive. Those patients got whisked away to asylums almost immediately, but people who were quietly depressed, who withdrew into themselves, they could suffer at home for much longer before anyone intervened. The admission process was compulsory. Every single one of those 511 people was committed against their will. There was no such thing as voluntary admission for paupers, and once you were in, getting out was extraordinarily difficult. The discharge records from St. Lawrence's show that patients could be released in one of 4 ways: recovered, relieved, not improved, or dead. Recovered meant you were supposedly cured. Relieved meant you were better but not fully healed. Not improved meant exactly what it sounds like. And dead, well, that one needs no explanation. Some patients did get out relatively quickly. The records show that a substantial number were discharged after just a few weeks or months marked as recovered. But many others were there for years, decades even, and many died inside those walls, never seeing freedom again. The average stay varied wildly depending on your diagnosis and, frankly, your luck. Now, here is something that should make you think. The law required these asylums to exist, but it did not require them to be adequately funded. Counties built these massive buildings, but then discovered they were horrifically expensive to run. You needed to feed hundreds of people. You needed to heat enormous structures through cold British winters. You needed to employ doctors, nurses, attendants, cooks, cleaners, groundskeepers. The costs were astronomical and county budgets were tight. So what happened? Corners got cut. Asylums that were designed for 300 patients found themselves holding 600. Buildings meant to be places of healing became warehouses for human beings. Staff-to-patient ratios became ridiculous. One nurse might be responsible for 50 or 60 patients on a single ward. How do you provide individualized care under those conditions? You do not. You cannot. You manage. You control. You survive the shift and hope nobody dies on your watch. And there was another factor that made everything worse: the class system. Victorian England was obsessed with social hierarchy, and that obsession seeped into every aspect of asylum life. If you were wealthy and developed a mental illness, you had options. Your family could place you in a private asylum, a comfortable facility that might look like a nice country house, where you would have your own room, decent food, and staff who treated you with some measure of respect. You would pay handsomely for this privilege, but you would retain your dignity. But if you were poor, you became a pauper lunatic, and the experience was entirely different. County asylums were divided strictly by class. Pauper patients slept in crowded dormitories, ate cheap institutional food, wore rough workhouse-style uniforms, and were treated as inmates rather than guests. The message was clear: your poverty made you less deserving of care, less deserving of humanity. Let me tell you about the paperwork, because it reveals how systematic this all was. To legally detain a pauper lunatic, the asylum needed specific documentation. First, a statement of particulars, basic information about the patient. Second, a medical certificate signed by the doctor who examined them. Third, an order from a justice of the peace authorizing their detention. All of this had to be filed correctly, or technically, the confinement was illegal. In practice, though, who was checking? Who was making sure the paperwork was legitimate? Who was protecting people from wrongful confinement? The answer is almost nobody, at least not until the scandal started piling up. The 1845 Lunacy Act did create something called the Commissioners in Lunacy, a group responsible for inspecting asylums and ensuring standards were being met. But there were not enough commissioners, and they could not possibly visit every asylum frequently enough to catch all the abuses. So the system stumbled along, growing larger and larger, confining more and more people, with inadequate oversight and insufficient funding. By the late Victorian era, asylum populations had reached their peak. Think about what that means. In a country of roughly 30 million people in the late 1800s, over 100,000 were locked away in mental institutions. That is 1 in every 300 people. Entire generations of families had someone, a mother, a brother, a cousin, an aunt, who disappeared behind asylum walls and never came back. And here is the tragedy. Many of these people probably were not even seriously mentally ill by modern standards. They were inconvenient. They were poor. They were different. They challenged social norms. They did not fit into the neat boxes that Victorian society required everyone to occupy. So they were labelled insane and removed from sight. But in the midst of all this institutional expansion, in the midst of this great confinement, something else was happening too. Reformers were fighting back. Doctors were beginning to question the old brutal methods. New ideas about treatment were emerging, ideas that centered on kindness, on dignity, on seeing patients as human beings rather than animals to be caged. These reformers would face enormous resistance, because changing a system this entrenched is like trying to turn a battleship with a canoe paddle. But they tried anyway, and some of them succeeded in ways that would transform asylum care. So we have seen how Britain built its mental empire, how law and policy created a network of confinement that spread across the nation. We have seen the numbers, the processes, the class divisions that determined who got help and who got warehoused. But now we need to understand what happened when someone dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there was a better way. What happened when doctors proposed treating the mad with kindness instead of chains? What happened when the idea of moral treatment swept through Victorian medicine like a revelation? That is where our story turns next, and I promise you, it is more complicated and more fascinating than you might expect. Stay with me. Sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come not from grand institutions or powerful governments, but from ordinary people who simply cannot stomach the cruelty they witness. And in the story of Victorian asylums, that revolution began with a tea merchant. His name was William Tuke. He was a Quaker living in York, and in 1796 he did something that would change the course of psychiatric history. He built an asylum where patients were treated like human beings. I know that sounds like the lowest possible bar to clear, treating people like humans, but you have to understand how radical this idea was at the time. Remember, this was an era when chaining patients to walls was standard practice, when spinning someone in a chair until they vomited was considered therapy, when the prevailing medical wisdom said that mentally ill people were closer to animals than to rational beings. Into this landscape walked William Tuke, looked around and said, essentially, what if we tried being kind? The story of how the retreat came to exist is actually quite sad. In 1791, a Quaker woman named Hannah Mills was admitted to the York Lunatic Asylum. She died there just a few weeks later under mysterious circumstances. Her family and friends in the Quaker community were not allowed to visit her before she died. They were not given a satisfactory explanation of what happened. They were shut out, kept in the dark and left to grieve without answers. William Tuke was deeply troubled by this. He began asking questions. What was happening inside these asylums? How were patients really being treated? And the more he learned, the more horrified he became. So Tuke decided to create an alternative. He founded the retreat just outside York in 1796, and it was designed from the ground up to embody completely different principles. The facility was small, built to house around 30 patients, not 300, not 3,000, 30. This was intentional. Tuke believed that healing required personal attention, that you could not treat someone as an individual if they were one face in a crowd of hundreds. The physical environment was meant to feel like a home, not a prison. Patients had their own rooms. The building was surrounded by gardens where residents could walk freely, breathe fresh air and feel sunlight on their faces. There were no chains, no manacles, no iron bars on windows unless absolutely necessary for safety. Physical punishment was completely banned. Can you imagine being a mentally ill person in 1796 and arriving at the retreat after hearing stories about other asylums? It must have felt like stepping into a different world entirely. But here is what made the retreat truly revolutionary. It was not just about removing the worst abuses. It was about actively creating an environment of dignity and respect. Tuke and his staff developed what they called moral treatment, and at its heart was a simple but profound idea that mentally ill people were still rational beings who could respond to kindness, structure, and encouragement. Let me tell you what a day at the retreat actually looked like, because the details matter. Patients were expected to dress properly every day, not in uniforms but in regular clothing. They took their meals together at a common table, using real plates and silverware, not eating from wooden bowls like prisoners. Conversation was encouraged. Polite, normal conversation about the weather, about the gardens, about anything really. Can you imagine? After years of being screamed at by attendants or locked in silence, patients at the retreat sat down for afternoon tea and chatted like civilized adults. Work was part of the routine too, but not as punishment. Patients were encouraged to practice their trades if they had them, or to learn new skills. The idea was that meaningful occupation kept the mind engaged and gave people a sense of purpose. Men might work in the gardens, care for farm animals, or do carpentry. Women might sew, knit, or help with cooking. This was not forced labor to save money. This was occupational therapy before that term even existed. The staff at the retreat were trained to be patient and gentle. They were taught to view themselves not as jailers but as caregivers. The superintendent was supposed to act as a father figure, authoritative but benevolent. When patients misbehaved or became agitated, the first response was not violence or restraint. Staff were instructed to talk to them, to try to understand what was causing the distress, to de-escalate the situation through calm conversation. Now, I will be honest with you, the retreat was not perfect. Physical restraints were still used but sparingly, and only as a last resort. Tuke believed they could be tools of modification, used temporarily to prevent someone from hurting themselves or others. But the key word is temporarily. At the retreat, you were not chained to a wall for 12 years. You might be restrained for a few hours during an acute crisis, then the restraints came off. That distinction mattered enormously. There was also a system of rewards and punishments built into moral treatment. Good behavior was praised and sometimes rewarded with small privileges. Disruptive behavior might result in temporary isolation or loss of privileges. Critics have pointed out that this was still a form of behavioral control, still a way of forcing patients to conform to societal norms, and they are not wrong. But compared to being beaten with sticks or starved as punishment, this was progress. The results were remarkable. Patients at the retreat showed improvement at rates that shocked the medical establishment. People who had been written off as hopelessly insane in other institutions began to recover at York. Some were discharged back to their families, able to function in society again. Word spread. Other reformers visited the retreat, observed what was happening, and returned home determined to implement similar approaches. William Tuke's grandson, Samuel Tuke, eventually wrote a book about the retreat called A Description of the Retreat, published in 1813. This book became incredibly influential. Samuel laid out the philosophy of moral treatment in clear, systematic detail. He provided evidence that kindness worked better than cruelty. He gave other asylum directors a blueprint they could follow, and slowly, painfully slowly, the ideas began to take hold. One of the people inspired by the Tukes was a man named William Ellis. In 1831, Ellis became the first superintendent of a brand new public asylum called Hanwell, located on the outskirts of West London. Hanwell was enormous compared to the retreat, built to house hundreds of pauper patients. Ellis looked at this massive county asylum and thought, can we make moral treatment work on a large scale? Ellis was particularly interested in the therapeutic value of work. He believed deeply that idleness was harmful to mental health, that patients who had nothing to do would sink deeper into their own troubled thoughts. So he created extensive work programs at Hanwell. Male patients worked on the asylum's farm, tended the gardens and maintained the grounds. Some learned trades like carpentry or shoemaking. Female patients worked in the laundry, the kitchen and the sewing rooms. The asylum aimed to be as self-sufficient as possible, and patient labour made that possible. But Ellis insisted, and this is important, that the work be meaningful and dignified, not exploitative. Patients were not slaves. They were participants in a community. The work gave them purpose, taught them skills, and prepared them for eventual discharge back into society. At least that was the theory. Then came John Connolly, and this is where moral treatment reached its most ambitious expression. In 1839, Connolly became the third superintendent at Hanwell Asylum. By this time, Hanwell was the largest county asylum in England, with over 1,000 patients. And Connolly made a decision that stunned the psychiatric world. He abolished all mechanical restraints, all of them. No more straitjackets, no more chains, no more leather straps or iron cuffs. Nothing. The declaration was absolute and immediate. Hanwell would become a non-restraint asylum, the first major public institution to make such a commitment. People thought Connolly was insane himself. How could you possibly manage 1,000 mentally ill patients without restraints? What would you do when someone became violent? How would you protect staff and other patients? Connolly had a plan. First, he massively increased staffing levels. If you could not restrain patients physically with devices, you needed more human beings present to provide what we would now call hands-on care. Attendants were trained in techniques of manual restraint, how to hold someone safely during a crisis without injuring them. Second, he emphasized constant supervision. Staff needed to be vigilant, watching for signs that a patient was becoming agitated so they could intervene before violence erupted. Third, he relied heavily on seclusion. If a patient became unmanageable, they would be placed alone in a padded room until they calmed down. Now, critics have pointed out that replacing mechanical restraints with seclusion was not exactly a huge leap forward. Being locked alone in a padded cell is still a form of restraint, just without the chains, and they have a point. But Connolly argued that seclusion was temporary and less physically damaging than being strapped down for hours or days. He also insisted that seclusion rooms be clean, comfortable, and safely padded, not dungeons. A visiting justice of the peace came to Hanwell in 1839 and reported being amazed at what he saw. He described patients being treated with uniform kindness and forbearance. He watched staff de-escalate potentially violent situations through calm conversation. He saw patients who, in any other asylum, would have been chained to walls, instead walking freely through gardens and attending recreational activities. The justice wrote glowing reports, and suddenly Hanwell became famous as a model institution. Other asylums across England began adopting non-restraint policies. John Connolly published books and articles explaining his methods. He became the most celebrated psychiatrist of his era, the face of progressive Victorian mental health care. By the mid-1800s, optimism about asylums reached an all-time high. Reformers genuinely believed they were on the verge of solving the problem of madness. They thought that with the right environment, the right treatment, the right balance of kindness and structure, they could cure mental illness. There were success stories that fed this optimism. Patients who arrived at asylums in acute distress were sometimes discharged months later, fully recovered. The discharge records from places like Hanwell and the Retreat showed that a significant percentage of patients were released with the notation "recovered" beside their names. For families who had watched loved ones descend into madness and despair, these recoveries seemed miraculous. But here is the uncomfortable truth that we need to confront. Moral treatment worked best in small institutions with adequate funding and carefully selected patients. The Retreat succeeded partly because it was small and exclusive. Hanwell succeeded under Connolly partly because he had the resources and the will to hire enough staff. But what happened when these idealistic principles collided with the reality of county asylums that were overcrowded, underfunded, and overwhelmed? What happened when the patient population exploded and there was no money to hire more attendants? What happened when idealistic young superintendents burned out and were replaced by administrators who cared more about budgets than about patients? What happened when the promise of cure gave way to the reality of chronic long-term mental illness that did not respond to kindness and tea parties? These are the questions that began to haunt the asylum system even at its moment of greatest hope. Because moral treatment was fragile, it required resources, commitment, and constant vigilance. And as we'll see, when those things disappeared, and they did disappear, the whole beautiful ideal came crashing down in ways that were almost more tragic than the original brutality. Because the original brutality was born of ignorance. But what came next was the collapse of hope, the death of optimism, the slow realization that maybe madness could not be cured after all. And that realization would transform Victorian asylums from places of treatment into warehouses of despair. But we're not there yet. Right now, in this moment of our story, let us pause and appreciate what the Tukes and Connolly accomplished. They proved that kindness was possible. They showed that mentally ill people could respond to dignity and respect. They planted seeds that would eventually grow into modern psychiatric care, even if they could not see that distant harvest. Next, we need to understand why and how this revolution failed, why the dream of moral treatment died, and what that failure meant for the thousands of people trapped in the Victorian asylum system. The fall is always harder when you've climbed so high. Stay with me. There is a particular kind of tragedy that comes from watching something beautiful slowly rot from the inside. And that is exactly what happened to the Victorian asylum system in the second half of the 19th century. The ideals of moral treatment, the hope that kindness could cure madness, the belief that asylums could be places of healing, All of it crumbled under the weight of forces that nobody had anticipated. What began as a revolution ended as a slow-motion catastrophe, and the people who suffered most were the patients who had been promised so much. Let me take you back to that moment of peak optimism, around 1850. Reformers like John Connolly were publishing triumphant reports. Newspapers were running stories about miraculous recoveries. The public actually believed that science and compassion had found the answer to mental illness. Parliament was throwing money at asylum construction. Everything seemed to be working. And then, quietly at first, then with gathering speed, it all started to fall apart. The first crack in the foundation was demographic. Britain in the mid-1800s was experiencing something unprecedented. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and people were flooding from rural villages into rapidly growing cities. Between 1801 and 1851, Britain's population nearly doubled, growing from about 10 million to almost 20 million people. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool exploded in size almost overnight. And with that population boom came a corresponding increase in the number of people who ended up in asylums. Here is where things get interesting and a bit mysterious. Historians are still debating this question. Did mental illness actually increase during the Victorian era, or did society just become less tolerant of it? Think about it. In a rural village where everyone knows everyone else, if your uncle goes a bit odd, the family takes care of him. He still lives at home, maybe helps with simple tasks, and life goes on. But in a crowded urban tenement where nobody knows their neighbours, where everyone is struggling to survive, where there is no extended family network, that same uncle becomes a problem. He cannot hold a factory job. He disrupts the household. He might end up on the streets causing trouble. Suddenly, the asylum looks like the only solution. Whatever the reason, the numbers were staggering. In the United States, asylum populations jumped 927% between 1850 and 1890. 927%. Britain and Germany saw similar increases. In France, asylums were routinely taking in double their maximum capacity. Imagine an asylum built for 500 patients trying to house 1,000. Where do you put them all? How do you feed them? How do you maintain any semblance of individual care when you're that overwhelmed? The asylum at Hanwell, which John Connolly had managed so brilliantly, provides a perfect case study of this collapse. When Connolly took over in 1839, Hanwell housed about 1,000 patients. By the 1860s, that number had grown to over 1,500. By the 1880s, it was approaching 2,000. 2,000 patients in a facility designed for 1,000. The beautiful ideal of personal attention, of knowing each patient as an individual, became impossible. How could it not? And funding did not keep pace with population growth. County governments were legally required to maintain these asylums, but they were also deeply reluctant to raise taxes. So asylum administrators faced an impossible choice: turn away patients and violate the law, or accept everyone and try to make the money stretch. They chose the latter, and quality of care collapsed as a result. Staff levels, which Connolly had insisted were crucial to non-restraint, were slashed. Remember, his system worked because he had enough attendants to watch patients constantly, to intervene before crises escalated. But when you are trying to feed 2,000 patients on the budget meant for 1,000, you cannot afford to hire adequate staff. Attendants who were already overworked became responsible for more and more patients. One nurse might be assigned 60 or 70 patients on a single ward. At that ratio, constant supervision becomes a dark joke. What do you think happened to moral treatment under those conditions? It disappeared. Attendants who were exhausted, underpaid, and overwhelmed had no energy for gentle conversations over tea. They needed to maintain order, prevent violence, and survive their shifts. So the old tools came back out. Restraints reappeared. Straitjackets, which had been abolished with such fanfare, started showing up in storage rooms again. Padded cells, which were supposed to be temporary, became long-term holding pens. And then came the chemical restraints. The Victorian era saw the development of the first effective sedatives. Drugs like bromides, chloral hydrate, and paraldehyde could calm agitated patients, make them docile and manageable. At first, these medications were hailed as medical progress. Look, we can treat madness with chemistry. But in overcrowded, understaffed asylums, sedatives became tools of control rather than treatment. A patient causing problems? Give them a dose of chloral hydrate and they will sleep for 12 hours. Problem solved. Except, of course, you have not treated anything. You have just knocked someone unconscious. Let me read you something that breaks my heart. In 1871, John Connolly himself, the great champion of non-restraint, wrote a bitter complaint about what was happening to asylums. He said, and I am quoting here, "The magistrates go on adding wing after wing and story after story, contrary to the opinion of the profession and common sense, rendering the institution most unfavourable for the treatment of patients." Can you hear the despair in those words? Connolly watched the system he helped create turn into something monstrous. He saw county governments building larger and larger asylums, thinking that bigger was better, when in fact bigger was destroying any possibility of genuine care. He was old by then, at the end of his career, and he must have felt like his life's work had been for nothing. In 1893, more than 20 years after Connolly died, an inspector visited Hanwell Asylum to assess its conditions. His report was devastating. He described gloomy corridors and wards, an absence of decoration, brightness, and general smartness, and a want of sufficient ventilation. The place that had once been a beacon of hope had become exactly the kind of depressing warehouse that moral treatment was supposed to replace. The inspector concluded his report by saying it would be astonishing to find any cures ever made there. Think about what that means. In less than 50 years, Hanwell went from being the most celebrated asylum in England to being a place where recovery was considered astonishing. That is not just decline. That is complete systemic failure. And it was not just Hanwell. This pattern repeated across Britain. Asylums that had started with such noble intentions became custodial institutions, places where you stored people, not places where you helped them. The medical superintendent stopped talking about cure rates and started talking about management strategies. The optimism of the 1840s gave way to what historians call psychiatric pessimism in the 1880s and 1890s. This pessimism was fed by another development in Victorian medicine, the rise of biological psychiatry. Doctors became increasingly convinced that mental illness was caused by brain lesions, by physical abnormalities in the organ itself, and if madness was caused by incurable brain damage, well, what was the point of moral treatment? You cannot tea party your way out of a lesion. This biological model gave asylum doctors an excuse to give up on actual treatment and focus on containment. Now, I want to be fair here. Some of this pessimism was justified. Victorian doctors were encountering large numbers of patients with what we would now recognize as chronic conditions: schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorder, dementia. These are illnesses that do not respond to kindness and structure alone. Without modern medications, which would not be developed for another 70 or 80 years, many of these patients genuinely could not be cured. The Victorian doctors were not wrong about that. But the tragedy is that they stopped trying. They stopped asking whether there might be other approaches, other possibilities. They accepted the situation as hopeless and resigned themselves to simply warehousing people until they died. And that resignation created a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you treat patients as incurable, if you warehouse them in gloomy, overcrowded wards with no stimulation and no hope, of course they will not get better. Of course they will deteriorate. There is a concept in institutional care called institutionalization. It happens when people who live in total institutions, prisons, orphanages, long-term hospitals, lose the ability to function in the outside world. They become dependent on the structure and routine of the institution. Their personality starts to fade. They stop making decisions, stop expressing preferences, stop being fully human in a sense. And Victorian asylums, especially in the late 19th century, were perfect machines for creating institutionalization. Imagine living in one of these places. You're one of 2,000 patients. You sleep in a dormitory with 50 other people. You eat bland food at exact times every day. You sit on hard benches for hours with nothing to do, because the therapeutic work programs have been abandoned due to lack of staff supervision. You never go outside the asylum walls. You never make a single choice about your own life: when to sleep, what to eat, where to go, what to wear. Years pass like this. A decade passes. How would you change? What would you become? Many patients developed what was called asylum dementia, a syndrome where long-term inmates became apathetic, withdrawn, and unable to care for themselves, even if their original condition was not that severe. Modern psychiatrists looking back at Victorian case notes can often tell when someone had actual dementia versus asylum-induced deterioration. The difference is in the progression. True dementia gets worse steadily. Asylum dementia appears gradually after years of institutionalization, almost like the person is slowly giving up. And here is something that will make you angry. As asylums became more and more custodial, as they gave up on the pretense of cure, they also became cheaper to run. You do not need highly trained attendants if you are just warehousing people. You do not need occupational therapy programs or recreational activities. You do not need good food or comfortable furnishings. You can pack patients into large dormitories, feed them cheap institutional food, and spend as little as possible. County governments, always watching their budgets, were quietly relieved. They had built these expensive asylums because the law required it, but now they could run them on the cheap. The final nail in the coffin of moral treatment was the sheer longevity of many patients. The early reformers had assumed that most patients would either recover and be discharged or die relatively quickly. What they did not anticipate was the rise of long-term chronic patients who needed care for decades. By the 1870s and 1880s, many asylums had a core population of elderly chronic patients who had been there for 20, 30, even 40 years. These patients required significant resources but showed no hope of improvement. They were living proof that the dream of cure had failed. Superintendents found themselves caught in an impossible situation. They had wards full of chronic patients who needed lifelong care, but they also had a constant stream of new acute cases arriving. How do you allocate resources? Do you focus on the new patients who might still be helped, or do you maintain decent conditions for the chronic population who will never leave? In practice, the chronic patients lost out. They were moved to the most overcrowded wards, given the least attention, essentially forgotten. And so the Victorian asylum system, which had started with such hope, with such revolutionary ideals, ended up creating exactly what it had promised to prevent. Instead of replacing the brutality of earlier centuries with science and compassion, it built a new kind of horror. The horror of neglect, of hopelessness, of slow institutional death. In some ways, that might have been worse than the original cruelty. At least overt violence is obviously wrong, but the slow, grinding misery of the late Victorian asylum was sanitized, justified by medical pessimism, hidden behind professional language. The reformers had been right about one thing, though. Kindness did matter, moral treatment did work, when it was actually implemented with adequate resources. The problem was not that their ideas were wrong. The problem was that their ideas were fragile, unable to survive contact with economic reality and demographic pressure. That is the heartbreak of this part of the story. The failure was not in the vision. The failure was in the execution, in the unwillingness of society to commit the resources necessary to make that vision real. But before we despair completely, we need to understand something else. Not all patients experience Victorian asylums the same way. Your experience depended enormously on what you were diagnosed with, and that brings us to a whole other dimension of this story that is equally troubling. The Victorian medical establishment had very specific, very odd ideas about mental illness, and those ideas determined who got locked away and how they were treated. Let us explore the strange, sometimes bizarre world of Victorian psychiatric diagnosis, because it will help explain how someone like you or me might have ended up behind asylum walls for reasons that would shock you. That is where we turn next. Words have power, and nowhere was that more evident than in Victorian psychiatry. The labels doctors attached to patients determined everything: where you were housed, how you were treated, whether you had any hope of getting out. And the truly disturbing part is that these diagnostic categories were wildly inconsistent, deeply influenced by social prejudice, and sometimes had almost nothing to do with actual mental illness. A label could destroy your life, and the person giving you that label might have no idea what they were actually diagnosing. Let me start with the three big diagnoses that dominated Victorian asylums: mania, melancholia, and dementia. These sound straightforward enough, right? Mania meant you were overactive, agitated, possibly violent. Melancholia meant you were depressed, withdrawn, lethargic. Dementia meant you had lost your mental faculties, simple categories for a complex problem. Except nothing about Victorian psychiatry was simple. Here is a fascinating piece of data that reveals just how confused everyone was. In 1849, a prominent psychiatrist named Isaac Ray wrote something remarkable. He said, and I am quoting here, "No one can be sure that by monomania, melancholia, moral insanity, or many other terms, he understands precisely what his neighbour does." Think about what that admission means. A leading expert in the field is essentially saying, we have all these diagnostic terms, but nobody actually agrees on what they mean. That is not medicine. That is chaos with a professional vocabulary, and the evidence backs up Ray's concern. In the 1870s, researchers looked at asylum admission records from different parts of England, and they found something shocking. At an asylum in Buckinghamshire, 71% of patients were diagnosed with mania. 71%. Meanwhile, at the Bodmin Asylum in Cornwall, only 28% of patients received that same diagnosis. What do you make of that? Were people in Buckinghamshire 3 times more likely to be manic than people in Cornwall? Or were doctors in Buckinghamshire just more likely to use that label? The answer is obvious. The terminology was being used differently across the country. What one doctor called mania, another might call melancholia. What one superintendent diagnosed as dementia, another might classify as chronic mania. There was no standardization, no agreement, no consistency. Your diagnosis depended less on your actual symptoms and more on which doctor examined you and what his personal theories about mental illness happened to be. Let me give you an example from the Cornwall Asylum records that researchers studied in detail. Between 1870 and 1875, they admitted 511 pauper patients. The doctors classified the moral causes of illness separately from the physical causes. Now, in Victorian medical language, moral did not mean ethical or religious. It meant emotional, psychological, what we would now call psychosocial factors. So what did these doctors list as moral causes of insanity? Domestic trouble, financial worry, religious excitement, disappointed affection, fright, grief, anxiety, loss of employment. In other words, the normal stresses of human life were being medicalized and labeled as causes of insanity. Did you just lose your job and feel depressed about it? That is not a reasonable reaction to unemployment. That is moral insanity caused by loss of employment, and you need to be institutionalized. The physical causes they listed were equally broad: childbirth, injury, intemperance, which meant drinking too much, epilepsy, old age, heredity, masturbation. Yes, masturbation was listed as a cause of insanity in Victorian medical texts. I am not making this up. Doctors genuinely believed that certain behaviors could drive you mad, and they were not shy about asking invasive questions during examinations. But here is where things get really interesting, and by interesting I mean disturbing. Some diagnostic categories were explicitly designed as tools of social control. Take moral insanity, which was one of the most controversial diagnoses of the era. Moral insanity supposedly meant that your emotions and behaviors were disordered, but your intellect remained intact. You could reason normally, but you acted in ways that violated social norms. What did that look like in practice? A woman commits adultery? Moral insanity? A man gambles away his family's money? Moral insanity. Someone questions religious doctrine too loudly? Moral insanity. Do you see what is happening here? This diagnosis allowed doctors to declare people insane not because of delusions or hallucinations, but because they behaved in socially unacceptable ways. It was a medical label that enforced conformity. And here is the thing. Moral insanity was controversial even in Victorian times. Many doctors argued that it was not a real disease, that it was just a way to medicalize immorality. But other doctors defended it passionately, and it remained a legitimate diagnosis throughout the Victorian era. How many people were locked up in asylums essentially for being scandalous rather than for being mentally ill? We will never know the exact number, but we know it happened regularly. Then there was hysteria, perhaps the most gendered diagnosis in all of medical history. Hysteria was considered almost exclusively a female disease. The word itself comes from the Greek word for uterus, because ancient doctors believed the condition was caused by a wandering womb. By Victorian times, that anatomical theory had been discarded, but the association between hysteria and femininity remained absolute. What were the symptoms of hysteria? Oh, just about anything a woman might do that men found inconvenient or incomprehensible. Emotional outbursts, fainting spells, anxiety, depression, nervousness, headaches, stomach problems, sexual desire that was too strong, sexual desire that was too weak, opinions that were too forceful. The diagnostic criteria were so broad that basically any woman could be labelled hysterical if the doctor felt like it. Victorian society had very specific ideas about how women should behave. They called it the cult of true womanhood. A proper woman was supposed to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. She was the guardian of the home, the moral centre of the family, gentle and emotional but never excessively so. She existed in the private sphere, protected from the corrupting influences of the public world. This was the ideal, the standard against which all women were measured. So what happened to women who deviated from this ideal? They were pathologized. A woman who was too ambitious. Something must be wrong with her mind. A woman who expressed anger or sexual desire openly, clearly hysterical. A woman who wanted education or a career, unnatural, possibly insane. The diagnosis of hysteria gave Victorian men a medical justification for controlling women who stepped out of line, and the treatment for hysteria could be horrifying. Some doctors prescribed rest cures, which meant confining women to bed for weeks or months, forbidding them from reading, writing, or doing anything mentally stimulating. The idea was that women's brains were delicate and could be overstimulated by intellectual activity. Other doctors recommended marriage and childbirth as cures for hysteria, because obviously, what every anxious or depressed woman needs is more responsibility and less autonomy. Some doctors, particularly in North America, went even further with gynecological surgeries, but that is a horror we will explore more deeply in just a moment. Now, let me be clear. There were certainly some women in Victorian asylums who had genuine mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, but there were also many women who were institutionalized simply for being inconvenient, for having opinions, for wanting something other than the life prescribed for them, for being difficult to control. The records are full of examples. A woman admitted for religious excitement because she attended too many church services. A woman admitted for domestic trouble after arguing with her husband. A woman admitted for disappointed affection after a broken engagement. Read between the lines of these admission notes, and you start to see the real story. These were not necessarily mad women. These were unwanted women, inconvenient women, women whose families or husbands wanted them gone. And here is the truly chilling part. Under Victorian law, a husband could have his wife committed to an asylum with relatively little difficulty. He needed a doctor's signature and a magistrate's approval, but if he presented a convincing case that she was causing trouble at home, those were not hard to obtain. Once she was inside the asylum, she had almost no legal rights. She could not leave. She could not appeal the decision. She could not even write letters without them being read by asylum staff first. She was effectively disappeared. There are documented cases of perfectly sane women who spent years in asylums because their husbands wanted to be rid of them. Maybe to marry someone else. Maybe to take control of their money. Maybe just because they found their wives annoying. The asylum became a convenient dumping ground for difficult women, and the diagnosis of hysteria or moral insanity provided a respectable medical cover story. But gender was not the only factor that determined diagnosis. Class and ethnicity mattered enormously too. Poor immigrants, particularly those who did not speak English, were especially vulnerable to being labelled insane. Imagine being a recent arrival from Ireland, Italy, or Eastern Europe. You're struggling to survive in an unfamiliar country. You speak little or no English. You're living in poverty in a crowded urban slum. Then something happens. You lose your job. You get into an argument. You have a breakdown from stress and exhaustion. A doctor is called. He does not speak your language. He asks you questions through an interpreter if you are lucky, or just by shouting slowly at you if you are not. You cannot explain yourself, cannot tell him about your circumstances, cannot make him understand that you are not mad, just desperate and confused and terrified. He sees your inability to communicate as evidence of confusion and mental deficiency. He sees your poverty as evidence of moral weakness. He signs a certificate and you are sent to an asylum. Once there, you are surrounded by people speaking a language you do not understand. Staff members bark orders at you that you cannot follow. You cannot explain your needs, cannot ask questions, cannot tell anyone that you should not be there. How long do you think it would take before you actually did start to lose your grip on reality? How long before the isolation and confusion broke you? The Cornwall Asylum records show this pattern clearly. A significant number of admissions were immigrants, and their diagnoses often included phrases like unable to give coherent account or confused and incoherent speech. But was that incoherence a symptom of mental illness, or was it just a language barrier combined with terror? The doctors often could not tell the difference and did not seem particularly concerned about finding out. There was also the matter of what Victorians called senile dementia, which was essentially any mental decline in old age. Now, some of these patients genuinely had what we would now recognise as Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia, but Victorian doctors used dementia much more broadly. A young person with a head injury might be labelled as having dementia. Someone with severe chronic schizophrenia might be diagnosed with dementia praecox, premature dementia. The term was so elastic that it lost almost all meaning. And then there were the people who were not mentally ill at all in any meaningful sense, but who ended up in asylums anyway because society did not know what else to do with them. People with epilepsy, which Victorians associated with madness because they did not understand seizures. People with physical disabilities that made them unable to work. People who were simply old, poor, and had no family to care for them. The asylum became a catch-all institution for anyone who did not fit neatly into Victorian society's narrow boxes. One of the most tragic aspects of Victorian diagnosis was how circular it became. Once you were labelled insane and admitted to an asylum, everything you did was interpreted through that lens. If you protested your confinement, that was evidence of your delusions. If you became angry or depressed, that confirmed your diagnosis. If you tried to act normally and rationally, well, all insane people have lucid intervals, so that did not prove anything. There's literally no way to demonstrate your sanity once you had been certified as insane. The system created what we would now call a catch-22. The very act of being in an asylum changed how people perceived you. Fellow patients who seemed perfectly rational to each other were still considered mad by staff, because if they were not mad, why would they be there? The label became the reality, regardless of the facts. And here is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Victorian diagnosis. It was deeply influenced by class. Wealthy people had access to private doctors who might diagnose them with neurasthenia, a fashionable nervous condition that suggested you were too refined and sensitive for the modern world. Poor people got diagnosed with mania or dementia or moral insanity. Wealthy people went to comfortable private rest homes. Poor people went to county asylums. The same symptoms could result in completely different diagnoses depending on whether you had money. This diagnostic chaos, this confusion of social prejudice and medical terminology, meant that Victorian asylums held an incredibly mixed population. Some patients were genuinely, severely mentally ill. Others were experiencing temporary breakdowns from stress or trauma. Others were physically ill with conditions that affected their behaviour. Others were just poor, foreign, old, or female, and inconvenient. They were all thrown together in the same wards, given the same labels, subjected to the same treatments. And speaking of treatments, we need to talk about what actually happened to patients once they were diagnosed and admitted. Because the Victorian medical toolkit for treating mental illness was limited, often ineffective, and sometimes downright barbaric. The treatments reveal everything about how Victorians understood madness, not as a disease of the mind requiring psychological intervention, but as a disease of the body requiring physical correction. What they did to patients in the name of medicine will make you grateful you live in the 21st century. Let us explore that darker territory together next. If you have ever wondered why women were so dramatically overrepresented in Victorian asylums, the answer lies not just in diagnostic bias, but in something far more sinister. Victorian medicine had constructed an entire theory connecting women's reproductive organs to their mental state, and that theory justified some of the most invasive, brutal treatments ever inflicted on patients in the name of healing. What happened to women in Victorian asylums was not just neglect or misdiagnosis. It was systematic medicalized violence based on pseudoscience and misogyny. Let me take you to the London Asylum for the Insane in Ontario, Canada, because what happened there under one particular doctor reveals a pattern that repeated across the English-speaking world. His name was Dr. Richard Morris Buck, and he served as superintendent from 1877 until his death in 1902. Buck was not some fringe quack operating in secret. He was respected, celebrated even. He became a leader in Canadian gynecology, and his treatment methods were rooted in mainstream Victorian medical theory. The theory went like this. Women's reproductive organs, specifically the uterus and ovaries, were believed to be the source of their emotional and physical well-being. When a woman became mentally ill, Victorian doctors assumed the problem originated in her reproductive system. They called this the uterine theory of insanity, and it was taken deadly seriously by the medical establishment. If the uterus was the cause, then treating the uterus, or removing it entirely, would cure the madness. Simple, right? Horrifying, but simple. Dr. Buck embraced this theory wholeheartedly. He combined it with another popular Victorian belief, that curing the body would automatically cure the mind. Physical intervention, surgical intervention, could eliminate mental illness by eliminating its supposed physical cause. And so, at the London Asylum under Buck's direction, gynecological surgery became a regular treatment for female patients diagnosed with insanity. Hysterectomies, oophorectomies, which means removal of the ovaries, surgical procedures to correct the position of the uterus. These operations were performed on women who were diagnosed with mania, melancholia, hysteria, any mental condition that doctors wanted to attribute to reproductive dysfunction. And please understand, we are not talking about a handful of experimental cases. This was systematic. This was policy. The surgeries continued throughout Buck's tenure at the asylum, even as medical opinion began to turn against them in the 1890s. Critics called his procedures meddlesome. They accused him of the mutilation of helpless lunatics. These are direct quotes from medical journals of the time, but Buck defended his work until the day he died in 1902, insisting that gynecological surgery was a legitimate treatment for female insanity. Now, pause for a moment and think about what this means. Imagine being a woman in the 1880s. Maybe you are suffering from what we would now recognize as postpartum depression after childbirth. Maybe you're going through menopause and experiencing mood swings. Maybe you're just exhausted from poverty and overwork. You're admitted to an asylum, diagnosed with hysteria or some other conveniently vague condition, and then subjected to major abdominal surgery without anything resembling modern anesthesia or antiseptic technique. Your uterus is removed, your ovaries are taken out, and the doctors tell you this will cure your troubled mind. Did it cure anyone? Of course not. Mental illness does not work that way. But if you survived the surgery and many women did not because infection rates were astronomical, you were left sterile, mutilated, and often in chronic pain for the rest of your life. And if your mental state did not improve, well, that just meant the doctors had not removed enough. Maybe they needed to try again. This was happening across the English-speaking world, Britain, the United States, Canada. Wherever Victorian medical theories held sway, women were being subjected to gynecological surgery as psychiatric treatment. The logic was circular and unfalsifiable. If the surgery worked, that proved the uterine theory. If it did not work, that proved the patient was beyond help, or the surgery had not been radical enough. Either way, the theory survived, and more operations were performed. But gynecological surgery was only one weapon in the Victorian medical arsenal for controlling women. Let me tell you about something called the rest cure, because it reveals a different kind of violence, psychological rather than physical, but no less damaging. The rest cure was invented by an American physician named Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s, and it quickly spread to Britain and became a standard treatment for what doctors called neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion in women. The treatment protocol was remarkably specific. The patient would be confined to bed, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. She was forbidden from sitting up, from reading, from writing, from doing any intellectual work whatsoever. She was fed a rich diet designed to make her gain weight, because Victorians believed thinness in women indicated nervous weakness. She was often isolated from family and friends. She was allowed no stimulation, no activity, no autonomy. The theory was that women's nervous systems were more delicate than men's, and that intellectual or emotional exertion could overtax their limited capacity. Rest would restore their energy. Fattening them up would strengthen their constitution. Isolation would protect them from external stresses. In practice, the rest cure was a recipe for severe depression and psychological breakdown. The writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman underwent the rest cure and later wrote a famous short story about it called The Yellow Wallpaper. In the story, a woman confined to bed rest slowly descends into madness, becoming obsessed with the wallpaper in her room. Gilman wrote from experience. She later said the rest cure nearly destroyed her, and she recovered only after she abandoned the treatment and returned to active work. But countless other women had no choice. In Asylums, the rest cure was not optional. You could not simply decide it was not working and go back to normal life. And here is the bitter irony. While women were being prescribed rest and idleness, men with similar symptoms were prescribed activity and work. Remember how moral treatment emphasized meaningful labor as therapeutic? That applied primarily to male patients. Women were supposed to rest. Men were supposed to work. The gender assumptions baked into Victorian psychiatry were staggering. This double standard extended to every aspect of asylum life. Male patients at many institutions were allowed, encouraged even, to go outside to play cricket or tend gardens, to engage in physical activity. Female patients were confined indoors. They could perhaps take gentle walks around the gardens if they were well behaved, but strenuous activity was considered dangerous for their delicate constitutions. So women sat indoors on hard benches for hours, with nothing to do, slowly going mad from boredom and inactivity. The assumption underlying all of this was that women existed primarily as reproducers and moral guardians of the home. When a woman could not fulfill these roles, when she became mentally ill or simply difficult to control, she had failed at her fundamental purpose. And Victorian medicine had ways of correcting that failure, through surgery, through forced rest, through confinement, through any means necessary to restore her to proper feminine function or remove her from society entirely. Let me tell you about another aspect of this gendered nightmare: the ease with which husbands could have wives committed. Under Victorian law, a married woman had almost no legal rights. She was essentially the property of her husband. Her money became his money. Her children were legally his, and if he wanted to be rid of her, an asylum provided a convenient solution. The process required a doctor's certificate and a magistrate's approval, but neither was difficult to obtain if a man presented his case correctly. "My wife has become hysterical, doctor. She weeps at nothing. She argues with me. She neglects the children. She has strange ideas about women's rights." A sympathetic physician would examine the wife, ask leading questions designed to elicit irrational responses, and sign the certificate. The magistrate would rubber stamp the order, and suddenly a woman who was perhaps just unhappy in her marriage, or depressed, or angry about her lack of autonomy, would find herself locked in an asylum with no way out. Once inside, she could not leave until her husband agreed to take her back, which he had no incentive to do. She could not write letters without them being intercepted and read by asylum staff. She could not hire a lawyer. She could not access her own money, assuming she had any. She was effectively disappeared, and it was all perfectly legal. There are documented cases of women who spent years in asylums because their husbands wanted to marry other women, or wanted control of their wives' inheritances, or simply found them inconvenient. The asylum became a tool of domestic oppression, and the diagnosis of insanity provided a respectable cover story. "She is not well," the husband would say sadly to friends and family. "The doctors say she needs treatment." Such a tragedy. Meanwhile, his wife was trapped behind asylum walls, screaming that she was sane, which only proved to the staff that she was delusional. Now, I do not want to suggest that all women in Victorian asylums were wrongfully confined. Many were genuinely suffering from severe mental illnesses and needed care, but the system was set up in a way that made abuse almost inevitable. The power imbalance was too great. The diagnostic criteria were too vague. The legal protections were too weak. And the underlying assumptions about women's nature and women's proper place in society were too deeply entrenched. Consider the concept of the fallen woman that was so important to Victorians. This was a woman who had given in to sexual temptation, who had lost her virtue, usually through seduction or prostitution. Victorian society was obsessed with these women, with saving them, reforming them, or at minimum removing them from public view. Asylums became one destination for fallen women. If you were a prostitute who got arrested enough times, if you were an unwed mother, if you had been sexually assaulted and society blamed you for it, you might end up diagnosed as morally insane and sent to an asylum. The asylum was supposed to restore your respectability, to prepare you to return to society in an acceptable female role, meaning as a servant or perhaps a wife if you were very lucky. But in practice, the stigma of having been in an asylum was often impossible to overcome. Your prospects were destroyed. You were marked forever as someone who had been mad and who might become mad again. Employment was difficult to find. Marriage was unlikely. Many women who were discharged from asylums ended up right back in them, not because they were insane, but because society had no place for them. The cruelty of this system is almost breathtaking. Victorian society created impossible standards for women. Be pure, be passive, be domestic, be silent, and then punished women who failed to meet those standards by labeling them insane. The medical establishment provided scientific justification for this punishment, and the asylum system provided the mechanism to enforce it. But here is what gives me hope in this dark story. Some women fought back. Some women told their stories and exposed what was happening, and eventually those stories forced society to confront the horrors being perpetrated in the name of medicine and moral order. We've already touched on Nellie Bly's groundbreaking investigation, but there were others too. Women who survived asylums and lived to testify about their experiences. Families who refused to accept the disappearance of their daughters and wives and fought for their release. Reformers who recognized that the system was being used to control women rather than help them. The gynecological surgeries eventually fell out of favor as medical knowledge advanced, and doctors realized they did not actually cure mental illness. The rest cure was gradually abandoned as the psychological harm it caused became undeniable. Legal reforms slowly gave women more rights, made it slightly harder to commit someone against their will. But these changes came slowly, painfully slowly, and not before thousands of women had suffered. I want you to remember these women tonight. The ones who were cut open on operating tables in pursuit of a cure that would never come. The ones who lay in enforced bed rest, staring at wallpaper while their minds deteriorated. The ones who were locked away by husbands who should have protected them. The ones who screamed that they were sane while doctors made notes about their delusions. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told. But women were not the only group that Victorian asylums targeted and mistreated. Class, as we've touched on, mattered enormously. And nothing reveals the class dimensions of Victorian psychiatry more clearly than looking at actual patient experiences, at what daily life was like inside these institutions, at how asylum populations were divided and controlled, at who got humane treatment and who got warehoused like livestock. That is where we need to go next, into the actual wards and corridors where these dramas played out every single day. Let us step inside together and see what daily life really looked like for the thousands of people trapped in the Victorian asylum system. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up in a Victorian asylum, not as a visitor, not as a doctor, but as a patient. What would your day actually look like? What would you see, smell, hear, taste, feel? Because understanding the daily reality of asylum life is crucial to grasping the full horror and occasionally the surprising humanity of these institutions. The devil, as they say, is in the details, and the details of Victorian asylum life reveal a world that was simultaneously more brutal and more complex than we might imagine. Your day would begin early, probably around 6 in the morning, when attendants walked through the dormitories ringing bells or banging on doors. If you were a pauper patient, and remember the vast majority were, you would be sleeping in a large room with anywhere from 20 to 60 other people. The beds were close together, sometimes so close you could reach out and touch your neighbour. Privacy did not exist. The air would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, because bathing was infrequent, and the smell of the chamber pots that sat under each bed, because there were no private toilets. You would have maybe 15 or 20 minutes to get dressed, use the communal toilet facilities if you could fight your way in, and make your bed to the exact specifications demanded by the attendants. Everything in an asylum ran on strict routine, because routine was how a small staff managed hundreds of patients. Any deviation from schedule was met with punishment, loss of privileges, confinement to your bed, or worse. Then came breakfast, and here is where the class divide became viscerally apparent. If you were a private patient with family paying for your care, you might eat in a smaller dining room with decent food, porridge with milk, bread with butter, perhaps some fruit. But as a pauper, you would line up in a massive dining hall with hundreds of others, sitting on hard benches at long wooden tables. The food was designed to be cheap and filling, nothing more. Breakfast might be a thin gruel, watery oatmeal with no seasoning, no milk, no sugar. a piece of bread that, as Nellie Bly famously described, was little more than dried dough, and tea or coffee that was barely recognizable as such, more like colored water than an actual beverage. Let me give you some specific testimony from asylum visitors and former patients, because their descriptions are damning. Nellie Bly, during her 10 days at Blackwell's Island in 1887, wrote that the food consisted of gruel broth, spoiled beef, bread that was little more than dried dough, and dirty undrinkable water. She described being constantly hungry, constantly thirsty, because the portions were inadequate and the water was so foul that drinking it made you sick. And Blackwell's was in New York City, one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Imagine what conditions were like in poorer, more remote asylums. After breakfast came the longest part of the day, and this is where the reality of asylum life became truly soul-crushing. What did you do all day? The answer, for most patients most of the time, was nothing. Absolutely nothing. You sat. You sat on hard wooden benches in large day rooms or corridors, and you were not allowed to move, not allowed to talk, not allowed to do anything except sit and wait for the hours to pass. Nellie Bly described patients being forced to sit still on benches for 12 hours or more, with scant protection from the cold, forbidden from speaking or moving. 12 hours. Think about that. Try sitting still in a chair for even 1 hour without moving, without talking, without any stimulation whatsoever. Now multiply that by 12. Now imagine doing that every single day, week after week, month after month, year after year. What would that do to your mind? How long before you genuinely started to lose your grip on reality? This was not therapy. This was not treatment. This was warehousing, pure and simple. The staff needed patients to be quiet and compliant so they could be managed with minimal effort. The easiest way to achieve that was to impose absolute stillness and silence. Any patient who talked too much, who got up and wandered, who showed any sign of independent action, was immediately punished. Now there were work programs in many asylums, remnants of the moral treatment era's belief in therapeutic labor. But by the late Victorian period, these programs had become exploitative more often than therapeutic. Male patients might be assigned to work on the asylum farm, tending crops and animals that fed the institution. They might do maintenance work, painting, carpentry, cleaning. Female patients worked in the laundry, which was brutal physical labor, or in the kitchen, or doing needlework. The work could be backbreaking, the hours long, and patients received no pay. The asylum benefited from free labor, and patients were told it was good for their recovery. For some patients, the work actually was therapeutic. It gave them something to do, a sense of purpose, a break from the mind-numbing routine of sitting still all day. But the choice was not theirs. You worked if staff decided you should work, and you worked at whatever task they assigned, regardless of your physical capacity or your preferences. And if you were elderly, or physically weak, or simply not useful as a labourer, back to the benches you went. Let me tell you about the gender divide in these work programs, because it reveals so much about Victorian assumptions. Men were allowed, even encouraged, to go outside. They worked in gardens, played cricket, engaged in physical activity that kept them healthy and relatively sane. But women? Women were confined indoors for the most part. The prevailing medical wisdom said that strenuous physical activity was dangerous for women, that their delicate constitutions could not handle it. So while men were outside in the fresh air, getting exercise and sunlight, women sat indoors in stuffy day rooms, growing pale and weak from lack of movement. This was not based on medical evidence. This was based on Victorian ideas about proper femininity. Ladies did not sweat. Ladies did not exert themselves. Ladies sat quietly indoors and did delicate handwork. And so female asylum patients were forced to conform to these ideals, even when conforming to them made their mental and physical health worse. Around noon there would be a dinner meal, the main meal of the day. Again, the quality depended entirely on your status. Private patients might get roasted meat, vegetables, bread, maybe even a dessert. Pauper patients got boiled potatoes, more bread, and meat that was often spoiled or so tough it was nearly inedible. Former patients testified that you learned to eat quickly and eat everything, because you never knew when the next adequate meal might come. Hunger was a constant companion for many asylum inmates. After dinner, more sitting, more silence, more waiting for time to pass. Occasionally there might be a break in the routine. On Sundays there might be a religious service. This was mandatory, regardless of your faith or your interest. You would sit in the asylum chapel and listen to a sermon about sin and redemption, about how your suffering was perhaps deserved, about how obedience and submission were the paths to health. Can you imagine being told, while locked in an asylum against your will, that your suffering was your own fault? Some asylums had recreational activities, though these became less common as overcrowding increased and budgets tightened. There might be dances or concerts, opportunities for patients to socialize under supervision. These events were cherished by patients as breaks from the monotony. We have photographs from some Victorian asylums showing patients dressed up for dances, playing badminton on the lawns, attending concerts. These images were often used for publicity, to show the public how progressive and humane the asylums were. But what the photographs did not show was how rare these events actually were, or how many patients were excluded from them because they were considered too unruly or too far gone. Music was taken relatively seriously in some institutions as a form of therapy. Doctors in the 1890s conducted experiments on the relationship between music and mental illness. Some asylum superintendents believed that music could alleviate depression, help with sleep, even treat physical pain. Patients who could play instruments were sometimes encouraged to form small ensembles. But again, this was the exception rather than the rule, and it applied mainly to better-funded institutions with more progressive leadership. As the afternoon dragged on, you might be called for some kind of treatment. And here is where we need to talk about what Victorian doctors actually did to patients in the name of therapy, because the treatments reveal everything about how they understood mental illness. Hydrotherapy was enormously popular. The theory was that water, applied in various temperatures and pressures, could shock the system and restore mental balance. In practice, hydrotherapy ranged from the merely unpleasant to the absolutely terrifying. At the gentle end, you might be given a warm bath, which was actually soothing. But warm baths required heating large amounts of water, which was expensive, so they were not common for pauper patients. More typical was what patients feared most: the cold bath treatment. Let me read you Nellie Bly's description of this because she experienced it firsthand and her words capture the horror. She wrote, "My teeth chattered and my limbs were goose-fleshed and blue with cold. Suddenly I got, one after the other, 3 buckets of water over my head, ice-cold water too, into my eyes, my ears, my nose and my mouth. 3 buckets of ice-cold water dumped over your head, while you stood naked and shivering, and that was just the beginning. Then attendants would roughly scrub you with hard brushes, not gently but almost violently, because the friction was supposed to stimulate your system. The water was rarely changed between patients. Dozens of people might bathe in the same tub of increasingly filthy water. The towels were shared too. Bly described being forced to dry herself with a towel previously used by patients with open sores and skin infections. After your bath, still shivering, you would be dressed in damp clothes, because the laundry never quite kept up with demand and nothing ever dried properly, and sent back to your ward. Many patients developed chronic respiratory infections from this treatment. Some died of pneumonia, but the baths continued, because the medical literature said they were beneficial. There were other water treatments too. Some asylums had high-pressure hoses that could be turned on agitated patients, blasting them with water until they were knocked down or gave up fighting. Others used wet sheet packs, where patients were wrapped tightly in cold, wet sheets and left for hours. The theory was that the cold would calm them and the restriction would prevent them from harming themselves. The reality was that it was a form of restraint that left patients terrified and sometimes hypothermic. Then there were the medications, though calling them that is almost generous. Victorian asylums had access to only a handful of sedative drugs. Bromides were common, salts that had a calming effect but could cause bromide poisoning with long-term use, leading to psychosis, weakness, and skin eruptions. Chloral hydrate was another favourite, a sedative that put patients to sleep but was highly addictive and could be fatal in high doses. Formaldehyde was used too, despite its horrible taste, and the fact that it made patients' breath smell like chemicals for days. These drugs were not prescribed carefully with attention to dosage and individual need. They were used as tools of control. A patient causing trouble, give them chloral hydrate and they will sleep for 12 hours. A patient who will not stop screaming, bromides until they are too sedated to make noise. The goal was not healing. The goal was compliance. Some doctors experimented with other treatments that seem bizarre to modernize. Static electricity applied to the head, injections of testicular fluids based on a theory that hormonal imbalances caused insanity, massage therapy, special diets. Some of these treatments were harmless if ineffective, others were actively harmful, but they were all presented as scientific medicine, as progress, as the best that contemporary knowledge could offer. As evening approached, around 6 or 7 o'clock, there would be a light supper, more bread, maybe some cheese or gruel. Then, shortly after, bedtime. The same crowded dormitories, the same lack of privacy, the same routine starting all over again the next morning. Day after day after day after day, with no variation, no hope of change, no end in sight unless you died or convinced a doctor you'd recovered. But here is what I want you to understand. Despite all of this, despite the terrible food, the brutal treatments, the crushing boredom, the loss of autonomy, some patients survived with their humanity intact. They formed friendships with other patients. They found ways to help each other, to share information, to maintain small acts of resistance. They held on to hope even when there seemed to be no rational reason for hope. Asylum records contain letters that patients wrote to family members, to doctors, to anyone who might listen. Many of these letters are heartbreaking in their desperate sanity. Please come get me. I do not belong here. I am not mad. If you would just listen to me, I could explain everything. But they also contain humour, observations about the world, concern for others. The human spirit is remarkably resilient, even in the darkest circumstances. What sustained people through asylum life? Sometimes it was faith. Sometimes it was the memory of loved ones outside. Sometimes it was simply stubborn refusal to give up. And sometimes it was the kindness of individual attendants or fellow patients who showed compassion in a system designed to crush it. Because not everyone who worked in asylums was cruel. Some attendants genuinely cared about the patients in their charge and did what they could within the constraints of a terrible system. But we need to hear directly from the people who lived this experience, from the patients themselves who managed to leave records of their time in Victorian asylums. Their voices, their stories, their perspectives have been marginalized by history, dismissed because they were labeled insane. It is time to listen to them, to hear what they have to tell us about what it meant to be deemed mad in the Victorian era. Let us turn now to the actual voices of patients, to the stories that survived against all odds, and discover that the line between sanity and insanity was far blurrier than Victorian doctors ever acknowledged. History is written by those in power, which means the voices of asylum patients have been largely silenced, dismissed as the ravings of madmen and madwomen whose testimony could not be trusted. But when we actually listen to what patients said and wrote, when we look at their letters and testimonies and the few first-hand accounts that survived, we discover something remarkable. Many of these supposedly insane people were articulate, observant, and disturbingly sane. Their stories challenge everything the Victorian medical establishment claimed about madness, and they force us to ask uncomfortable questions about who gets to decide what sanity means. Let me introduce you to two extraordinary men whose stories survived because their doctors at Bethlehem Royal Hospital took them seriously as intellectual equals rather than just as cases to be managed. Their names were Henry Francis Harding and Walter Abraham Hay, and their relationships with their physicians were so unusual for the Victorian era that historians still study them as examples of what was possible when doctors actually listened to patients. Henry Francis Harding was admitted to Bethlehem in the 1890s as a voluntary patient. Now, stop right there. Voluntary patient. I know we have talked about how most asylum admissions were compulsory, how people were certified as insane and locked away against their will. But there were exceptions, particularly at institutions like Bethlehem that served middle-class and wealthy patients. If you had money and social connections, you could sometimes admit yourself voluntarily when you felt you needed help, and you could leave when you felt better. This option was almost never available to pauper patients, but it existed for those who could afford it. Harding was educated, articulate, and deeply interested in understanding his own mental condition. Instead of treating him as a specimen to be observed, his doctors at Bethlehem engaged him in conversations about the nature of his illness. They asked his opinion on various theories of madness. They shared medical literature with him. In their case notes, they referred to him almost as a colleague, someone who could provide valuable insight into the subjective experience of mental illness. This was revolutionary. Most Victorian doctors believed that patients could not be trusted to describe their own symptoms accurately, that madness by definition meant your perception of reality was unreliable. But Harding's physicians recognized that he had expertise they lacked, expertise in what it actually felt like to experience his particular form of mental distress. They treated him as a consultant on his own case. Walter Abraham Hay had a similar relationship with his doctors, though his story was more complicated. He was initially admitted to Bethlehem under legal certification, meaning he was declared insane and committed involuntarily. But over time, his doctors came to see him differently. They enjoyed talking with him. They valued his observations. When he was eventually discharged, he was later readmitted on a voluntary basis during subsequent episodes of illness. The relationship between Hay and his physicians evolved from the traditional doctor-patient hierarchy into something more like friendship. Both men wrote letters that were preserved in Bethlehem's archives. These letters are fascinating because they show people grappling with their own mental illness, trying to understand it, trying to communicate their experience to others. They also reveal the importance that patients placed on having access to their doctors. In letter after letter, patients at Bethlehem requested meetings with physicians or complained about not seeing them often enough. Just being heard, being taken seriously, mattered enormously to their well-being. But Harding and Hay were exceptional cases. They had education, social status, and doctors who were willing to treat them as rational beings. What about the thousands of other patients who were not so fortunate? What did their voices sound like? Let me tell you about a woman named Sarah Gardner. She was a domestic servant, 26 years old, admitted to Bethlehem in 1857 with what the doctors described as great mental depression. We know from the records that she was discharged later that same year, which suggests her condition improved relatively quickly. But what was she experiencing during her time in the asylum? The case notes give us only the doctor's perspective, her symptoms, her behaviour as observed by staff. Sarah's own voice, her own description of what she was feeling and thinking was not recorded. Like most working-class women, her subjective experience was considered irrelevant to her treatment. Or consider the story of two men, John Bailey and his son Thomas, both admitted to Bethlehem in 1858 with diagnoses of acute melancholia. Father and son suffering together. Can you imagine the pain of that? Can you imagine being a father watching your child descend into the same darkness that has claimed you, knowing you are helpless to protect him? The records note their admission and their symptoms, but we do not know if they were housed near each other, if they were allowed to see each other, if they took any comfort in not being alone in their suffering. Then there is Richard Dad, perhaps the most famous patient in Bethlehem's history. Dad was a talented artist, part of London's artistic circles in the 1840s, but he began to experience delusions, believing that his father was not actually his father, but rather the devil in disguise. In 1843, in the grip of this delusion, Dad murdered his father. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of his life in asylums, first at Bethlehem, later at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. The remarkable thing about Dad is that he continued to paint throughout his confinement. The asylum staff recognized his talent and gave him materials, time and space to work. Some of his most celebrated paintings were created while he was institutionalized. There is a photograph of him in the asylum, paintbrush in hand, working on a canvas. He looks focused, absorbed in his art, almost peaceful. His paintings are fantastical, filled with fairies and mythological creatures, incredibly detailed and technically skilled. What do we make of Richard Dad? He committed a terrible crime, driven by delusions. He was clearly mentally ill by any standard, yet he was also capable of creating sophisticated, beautiful art that required planning, skill, and sustained concentration. Was he mad? Yes. Was he also sane in important ways? Also, yes. The human mind is not a simple binary of sane versus insane. Dad's life illustrates that complexity beautifully and tragically. The archives contain thousands of these fragmentary stories. A woman admitted for religious excitement because she attended too many prayer meetings. A man admitted for disappointed affection after his fiancée broke their engagement. An elderly woman suffering from what was probably dementia admitted because her family could no longer care for her. An immigrant who spoke no English admitted because his inability to communicate was mistaken for confusion and mental deficiency. Many of these patients were discharged after relatively short stays, marked as recovered in the records. This suggests that whatever they were experiencing, grief, stress, temporary breakdown, resolved with time and perhaps with the simple fact of being removed from the circumstances that had overwhelmed them. But others stayed for years, for decades, sometimes until death. The records note not improved, or simply record the date of death with no other comment. What strikes me about these patient records is how much they reveal about the observers and how little they reveal about the patients themselves. The doctors wrote about symptoms they could see, agitation, withdrawal, strange statements, but they rarely asked patients to explain their own experience. And when patients tried to explain themselves, their words were often interpreted as further evidence of insanity. Nellie Bly captured this perfectly in her account. She wrote, "From the moment I entered the insane ward on the island, I made no attempt to keep up the assumed role of insanity. I talked and acted just as I do in ordinary life. Yet strange to say, the more sanely I talked and acted, the crazier I was thought to be. This is the nightmare at the heart of the asylum system. Once you were labelled insane, everything you did was interpreted through that lens. Protest your confinement, that is a delusion. Become depressed, that confirms your diagnosis. Act perfectly rational. You must be having a lucid interval. There was no way to prove your sanity once you were inside, because the system was designed to be unfalsifiable." Bly also described meeting other women at Blackwell's Island who seemed perfectly sane to her. Women who had been committed because of poverty, because of language barriers, because vindictive family members wanted them out of the way. She wrote, "I left the insane ward with pleasure and regret. Pleasure that I was once more able to enjoy the free breath of heaven. Regret that I could not have brought with me some of the unfortunate women who lived and suffered with me, and who, I am convinced, are just as sane as I was and am now myself." Think about what Bly is saying here. She spent 10 days among asylum patients and concluded that many of them were not mentally ill at all. They were trapped, unable to convince anyone of their sanity, because who believes a mad person who says they are sane? The system created a perfect prison from which there was no escape, except through the arbitrary judgment of the very people who'd imprisoned you in the first place. There is another dimension to patient voices that we need to explore, and that is the voices of those who were readmitted multiple times. Victorian asylum records show that a significant number of patients went through cycles of admission, discharge, and readmission. Sometimes this happened because their illness was chronic and episodic. They would improve enough to leave, then relapse and need to return. But sometimes it happened because the asylum had become the only place they could go. A man named George Longmore provides a fascinating example. He was admitted to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum and eventually discharged. But 4 years later, after his sister died, he voluntarily readmitted himself. Why would someone who had been freed from an asylum choose to return? Perhaps because the outside world offered him nothing. No job, no family, no support system. The stigma of having been in an asylum made normal life nearly impossible. At least in Broadmoor he had shelter, food, and people who knew him. It was a terrible choice, but for some patients, it was the only choice they had. The letters that patients wrote are heartbreaking documents. Some were addressed to family members begging to be taken home. "Please visit me. Please remember me. Please get me out of here." Some were addressed to doctors or asylum superintendents, trying to convince them of the writer's sanity. "If you would only listen, I could explain. I understand why you think I am mad, but if you would give me a chance, I could prove otherwise." Many of these letters were intercepted by asylum staff and never delivered. This was standard practice. Letters from patients were read, censored, sometimes confiscated entirely. The justification was that delusional patients might write disturbing things that would upset their families, but the effect was to cut patients off from the outside world, to ensure that their version of events never reached anyone who might help them. Some patients were sophisticated enough to work around this censorship. They would write innocuous letters that passed inspection, while encoding messages about the true conditions. They would write to people outside their family, hoping these letters would be monitored less carefully. They would memorize the names and addresses of journalists or reformers and try to get messages to them through discharged patients or sympathetic staff. It was a desperate game, and most players lost. But some succeeded, and their testimonies eventually contributed to reform movements. What I want you to understand is that many asylum patients were not lost in delusion, unable to perceive or describe reality. They saw exactly what was happening to them. They understood that they were being mistreated, that the system was unjust, that their confinement was often unwarranted. And they tried to tell people. They wrote letters, they appealed to visitors, they told their stories to anyone who would listen. But they were labelled insane, which meant their testimony was automatically suspect. This raises profound questions about power and truth. Who decides what reality is? Who decides what counts as a rational perception of the world? In Victorian asylums, doctors had absolute authority to make these determinations. A patient could describe terrible abuse and mistreatment, and the doctor could simply write in the case notes, "Patient has paranoid delusions about persecution by staff." The patient's reality was erased, replaced with the doctor's interpretation. Yet when outside investigators like Nellie Bly or Edward Wakefield actually entered asylums and saw conditions for themselves, they confirmed what patients had been saying all along. The food was terrible, the staff was often cruel, the treatments were brutal, the patients were right. But it took someone with credibility, someone who had not been labelled insane, to make people believe it. I think often about those letters that were confiscated and filed away in asylum archives. Letters that said, "I am not mad. Please help me." Letters that were never answered because they were never delivered. How many people died in asylums trying to convince someone, anyone, that they did not belong there? How many voices were silenced simply by the label attached to them? But some voices did get through. Some patients were discharged and lived to tell their stories. Some wrote memoirs or gave testimony to parliamentary committees. Some found journalists or reformers willing to listen, and gradually, slowly, their accumulated testimony began to shift public opinion about what was happening inside asylum walls. The Victorian asylum system did not collapse because of humanitarian concern from the top down. It collapsed because of pressure from the bottom up, from patients and former patients and their families who refused to be silent, who insisted that their experiences mattered, who demanded to be heard. That is the power of giving voice to the voiceless. That is why patient testimony was so dangerous to the system and why it was so fiercely suppressed. We have heard from individual patients, but now we need to step back and look at the business side of this system, because Victorian asylums were not just medical institutions. They were economic entities, embedded in complicated financial and social networks. Money flowed through these institutions in ways that incentivized certain behaviors and made reform difficult. Understanding the economics of madness helps explain why the system persisted for so long, despite mounting evidence of its failures. Let us follow the money and see where it leads. Money tells stories that morality tries to hide, and nowhere is this more evident than in the Victorian asylum system. Behind the rhetoric about healing and compassion, behind the architectural grandeur and medical terminology, there was a stark economic reality that shaped every aspect of how these institutions operated. Understanding who paid, who profited, and who bore the costs reveals why the system functioned the way it did, and why it was so resistant to change even when everyone knew it was broken. Let us start with the most shocking example of asylum economics, Bedlam's decision to turn human suffering into entertainment. We touched on this earlier. but I want you to understand the specific financial calculations that made this possible. Between 1720 and 1770, Bethlehem Hospital allowed public visitors to tour the wards and view the patients for a fee. This was not a small side operation. This was a major revenue stream. Historical records show that during this 50-year period, visitor fees brought in an average profit of £300 to £350 per year. Now, £300 might not sound like much, but let me give you some context. In today's money, adjusting for inflation and purchasing power, that represents roughly £70,000 to £80,000 annually, or about $90,000 to $100,000. Every single year, for half a century, Bethlehem profited from exhibiting mad people to curious Londoners. That money paid staff salaries, it funded building maintenance, it kept the institution solvent when government funding fell short. Think about the incentive structure this created. The worse your patients looked, the more interesting they were to visitors. The more dramatic their symptoms, the more people paid to see them. So there was actually a financial disincentive to help patients recover or to present them as dignified human beings. Suffering was profitable. Exhibiting that suffering was good business, and the governors of Bethlehem, who were supposed to be charitable stewards of a medical institution, justified it by saying they needed the money to keep operating. In 1770, public visits to Bedlam were finally banned. But here is the twist. This was not because anyone suddenly developed a conscience about the ethics of human zoos. It was banned because of security concerns and overcrowding. The asylum had become too popular, attracting unruly crowds that the staff could not control. And once the visits were banned, once the public could no longer see what was happening inside, conditions for patients actually got worse in some ways. At least when there were visitors, there was some level of external scrutiny, however voyeuristic. Behind closed doors, staff abuses intensified because there was nobody watching. But Bedlam's ticket sales were unusual. Most Victorian asylums had to fund themselves through a combination of government appropriations and patient fees, and this created a brutal two-tier system. If you were wealthy and your family was paying for private care, you could afford a decent asylum that provided comfortable rooms, good food, and attentive staff. These private asylums operated like businesses, competing for wealthy clients by offering superior amenities. Some private asylums were genuinely luxurious. They resembled country estates more than hospitals. Private patients might have their own furnished rooms with views of landscaped gardens. They ate well-prepared meals with wine. They had access to recreational activities like billiards or tennis. Staff addressed them respectfully. These patients were customers, and in the marketplace of Victorian mental health care, customers with money got treated well. But private asylums also created opportunities for exploitation. Because they operated for profit, some unscrupulous operators cut corners on medical care while maintaining superficial appearances. The most notorious private asylums were essentially prisons where wealthy families could warehouse inconvenient relatives while maintaining a respectable facade. Mother is resting at a lovely facility in the countryside. Meanwhile, Mother was locked in a room with minimal care, and the family was being charged exorbitant fees for the privilege. The 1845 Lunacy Act was passed partly to regulate these private madhouses, because the potential for abuse was so obvious. The Act established the commissioners in lunacy, whose job was to inspect both public and private asylums to ensure minimum standards were being met. But there were never enough commissioners, and they could not possibly visit every facility frequently enough to catch all the problems. Private asylums that wanted to hide abuses had plenty of warning when inspectors were coming, and they became expert at presenting a sanitized version of their operations during official visits. Now contrast this with the county asylums that housed pauper patients. These institutions were funded by local government budgets, and county officials were perpetually trying to minimize costs. Remember, in Victorian England there was no income tax until late in the era. Local governments raised money through property taxes and other assessments, and taxpayers were not eager to pay more to support asylums full of poor people they would never meet. So county asylums operated on shoestring budgets. They fed patients the cheapest food possible. They hired the minimum number of staff. They delayed maintenance and repairs. They crammed more and more patients into spaces designed for fewer people. And because the patients were paupers with no money and no political power, there was little accountability. Who was going to complain? The patients themselves had no voice. Their families, if they had families, were equally poor and powerless. This brings us to a crucial economic fact about Victorian asylums. Patient labour was a significant part of how they stayed afloat. We talked earlier about work programs as therapy, but we need to be honest about what this actually was. It was free labour. Asylums used patient labour to farm their own food, to launder their own linens, to maintain their buildings, to produce goods that could be sold. Patients worked long hours at difficult tasks and received no wages. The justification was always therapeutic. Work is good for their minds. It gives them purpose and structure. And for some patients that was genuinely true, but the economic reality is that asylums could not have functioned without this free labour force. Imagine trying to feed and house 2,000 people, while also paying workers to grow food, cook meals, wash laundry, and maintain grounds. The costs would have been astronomical. Patient labour kept costs down, and county governments liked that just fine. Some asylums were remarkably self-sufficient because of patient labour. They had large farms worked by male patients, producing vegetables, grain, and dairy products. They had workshops where patients made furniture, shoes, and clothing. They had laundries staffed by female patients, who washed not only asylum linens, but sometimes contracted to wash linens for other institutions as well, generating revenue. The economic value of this labour was never calculated in official budgets, but it was substantial. Now, there is a darker side to the economics that we need to address, and that is wrongful confinement motivated by financial gain. This happened in several ways. First, there were cases where family members had elderly relatives declared insane so they could take control of their money and property. Victorian inheritance law was complicated, but if you could get someone declared mentally incompetent, you might be able to access their assets. An asylum provided a convenient place to stash an inconvenient relative while you pillaged their estate. Second, there were husbands who had wives committed to avoid paying alimony or to free themselves for remarriage. Divorce was expensive, difficult, and scandalous in Victorian England. But having your wife declared insane? That was tragic but respectable. And once she was in an asylum, you controlled her money and were free to do as you pleased. She was legally and practically erased. Third, and most cynically, there were some private asylum operators who actively recruited patients they did not need because each patient represented revenue. If you were a struggling middle-class family with a difficult elderly parent, a smooth-talking asylum director might convince you that institutionalization was the kindest option, that professional care was essential, that your loved one would be much happier in their facility. Once you signed the papers and the patient was admitted, monthly fees started accumulating, and getting someone out of a private asylum could be almost as difficult as getting them out of a public one, especially if the family had signed contracts agreeing to pay for care. The case of Nellie Bly's investigation illustrates another economic dimension. After her exposé was published in 1887, there was a grand jury investigation into conditions at Blackwell's Island Asylum. The jury found that Bly's reporting was accurate. The conditions were terrible. Patients were being abused and neglected. And you know what happened? The New York City government increased funding for the Department of Public Charities and Corrections by over $850,000. That is nearly $24 million in today's money. Think about what that number tells us. The money existed. The resources to improve conditions had always been available. But it took a massive public scandal to force the government to allocate those resources. For years, officials had been content to run the asylum on inadequate funding, and patients suffered as a result. Only when the suffering became public, when it became politically embarrassing, did the money suddenly materialize. This pattern repeated across the Victorian asylum system. Scandals would break out. Investigators would document terrible conditions. There would be public outrage and promises of reform. Money would be allocated for improvements. Then attention would shift elsewhere. Funding would gradually be cut again, and conditions would deteriorate until the next scandal. It was a cycle driven by economics and political will, or rather, the lack thereof. The class divide extended even to what happened after death. Wealthy patients who died in private asylums were typically returned to their families for proper burial in family plots. Poor patients who died in county asylums were often buried in unmarked graves on asylum grounds. No headstones, no individual markers, just mass graves for the mad and the forgotten. Even in death, poverty meant indignity. Some asylums had their own cemeteries, and these are haunting places if you ever visit one. Row upon row of small, simple markers, if there are markers at all. Sometimes just numbers instead of names. These graveyards represent thousands of people who died in institutions, far from home, buried by strangers, mourned by no one. The economics of madness followed people literally to the grave. But let us talk about the biggest economic factor of all, the sheer cost of keeping someone in an asylum for years or decades. A patient admitted at age 30 and dying at age 70 represents 40 years of expenses. Multiply that by thousands of patients, and you begin to understand the financial burden that chronic mental illness placed on Victorian society. County governments found themselves paying forever for people who would never recover and never leave. This is why there was such pessimism in late Victorian psychiatry. It was not just medical pessimism, the belief that mental illness was incurable. It was also economic pessimism. How could counties afford to house an ever-growing population of chronic patients? The answer was that they could not while maintaining anything resembling humane conditions. So quality of care declined, and asylums became warehouses, because that was the only economically sustainable option given the resources society was willing to allocate. Here is a question worth considering. What if Victorian society had been willing to spend more money on mental health care? What if county governments had funded asylums adequately, hired enough staff, provided good food and living conditions, supported long-term research into treatment? Would outcomes have been better? Honestly, probably not much better, because Victorian medicine did not have effective treatments for most severe mental illnesses. But the experience of being a patient would have been profoundly different. The suffering could have been reduced even if the illnesses could not be cured. The tragedy is that the choice was made again and again to prioritize cost savings over human welfare, and that choice was easier to make because the people who suffered the consequences, pauper lunatics, had no political power, no economic leverage, no way to force society to care about their well-being. By the early 1900s, the asylum system had reached a crisis point. There were too many patients, too little funding, and too much evidence that the whole enterprise was failing. But change was finally beginning to come, driven by a combination of factors: scandals that could not be ignored, advances in medical knowledge, shifting social attitudes, and eventually economic pressure as the cost became truly unsustainable. The asylum system would eventually collapse under its own weight, but that collapse took decades. In the meantime, thousands of people continued to live and die in these institutions, caught in a system that was simultaneously trying to help them and trying to warehouse them as cheaply as possible. The contradiction was never resolved. It just ground on, year after year, until finally the whole structure became untenable. But before we get to the end of this story, we need to talk about the legacy. Because Victorian asylums did not just disappear. They left behind physical structures that still exist today, some still in use. They left behind cultural memories and stereotypes about mental illness that persist. They left behind lessons about what happens when society tries to hide its most vulnerable people away. And they left behind ghosts, the literal abandoned asylum buildings and the metaphorical ghosts of everyone who suffered in them. Let us explore what remained after the asylum era ended and what it means for us today. Buildings remember what people try to forget, and across Britain today, there are dozens of massive Victorian asylum structures still standing, some renovated into apartments, some converted to museums, some simply abandoned and slowly crumbling. These buildings are monuments to a particular vision of how society should handle mental illness, a vision that ultimately failed. But they also hold stories that need to be remembered, lessons that remain painfully relevant, and warnings about what happens when we hide suffering behind institutional walls. Let me take you on a journey through what remains of the Victorian asylum system, starting with the place where our story began, Bedtime Royal Hospital. Bedlam has moved several times over its 800-year history. The Moorfields building that we talked about earlier, the one that looked like Versailles, was demolished in the 1800s. The hospital moved to a new location in Southwark in 1815, and that building stood until 1930, when Bedlam moved again to its current site in Beckenham, in the London borough of Bromley. The current Bedlam Royal Hospital is still operational. It is now part of the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust and serves as a modern psychiatric facility. But attached to the hospital is something remarkable: the Bedlam Museum of the Mind. This museum, housed in the hospital's art gallery building, preserves the history of mental health treatment and showcases artwork created by people with mental health conditions, both historical and contemporary. The museum holds thousands of patient records, photographs, and artifacts from Bedlam's long history. You can see the actual restraint devices that were used on patients. You can read case notes written by Victorian doctors. You can view paintings created by patients like Richard Dadd. The museum does not shy away from the difficult parts of Bedlam's history. It confronts them directly, asking visitors to think critically about how society has treated mentally ill people and how much has really changed. What strikes me about this museum is that it exists on the grounds of a still functioning psychiatric hospital. Patients receiving treatment today walk past exhibits about the horrors of the past. It is a physical reminder that mental health care has a history, that current practices evolve from earlier failures, and that we should never assume we have figured everything out. The ghosts of Bedlam quite literally share space with modern psychiatry. But Bedlam is unusual in having transformed itself so successfully. Many other Victorian asylums have had less dignified afterlives. Let me tell you about some of these places, because each one tells a different story about memory and forgetting. Hanwell Asylum, which we've discussed extensively as a site of both reform and decline, still exists. It is now called St Bernard's Hospital, and parts of the original Victorian structure remain. The site continues to provide mental health services, though on a much smaller scale than in the asylum era. The grounds that once held 2,000 patients now house modern facilities that serve the local community. If you walk around the area, you can see remnants of the old asylum, the chapel, some of the Victorian buildings, the high walls that once enclosed the estate. The Lincoln Asylum, one of the first large institutions to implement a non-restraint policy after a patient died while left overnight in a straitjacket, operated until 1985. After it closed, the buildings were converted into residential housing. You can now live in what used to be an asylum ward. The developers kept some of the architectural features, the high ceilings, the large windows, while dividing the vast institutional spaces into individual apartments. Imagine coming home each day to a building that once housed hundreds of people locked away from society. What do those walls remember? Some former asylums have become luxury apartment buildings, which creates a strange irony. Places that once represented society's rejection of its most vulnerable members are now expensive housing for the wealthy. The very exclusivity and isolation that made these sites suitable for asylums, located away from city centres, surrounded by extensive grounds, now makes them desirable real estate. The suffering has been literally paved over and marketed as historic character. Other asylums have been completely abandoned and are slowly decaying. These are perhaps the most haunting. Urban explorers and photographers seek them out, documenting the ruins before they collapse entirely. Inside these abandoned buildings you can still see evidence of their former purpose. Patient records scattered on floors, restraint chairs left in corners, ceramic tiles in bathrooms where cold water baths were administered. Graffiti left by trespassers mingles with century-old paint on walls that once heard screams and whispers. There is something deeply unsettling about abandoned asylums. They have become sites of supernatural legends, haunted buildings where people claim to hear voices or see shadows. I do not believe in ghosts, but I understand the impulse to haunt these places with stories. They deserve to be haunted. Too much suffering happened there to simply walk away and forget. If the dead cannot speak, perhaps the buildings can speak for them. Cornwall, where we have data from asylum records from the 1870s, closed its county asylum in the 1990s. The building stood empty for years before being demolished. But before it was torn down, researchers and historians documented everything they could, taking photographs, collecting remaining records, interviewing people who had worked there or been patients. This kind of documentation is crucial because once these buildings disappear, so does a tangible connection to this history. Some former asylum sites have become parks or nature preserves. The buildings are gone, but the land remains public space. You can walk where patients once worked in gardens or played cricket, with no marker to tell you what the place used to be. Is that erasure or mercy? I am not sure. Maybe both. But the physical buildings are only part of the legacy. Victorian asylums left behind cultural impacts that persist in subtle and not so subtle ways. When you hear the word asylum, what images come to mind? Probably not images of healing or hope. Probably images of horror, long corridors, screaming patients, cruel attendants, medical torture. This cultural association comes directly from Victorian asylum history and from the Gothic literature and horror films that have exploited that history. The word asylum itself became so tainted that modern mental health facilities refuse to use it. We say psychiatric hospital, or mental health centre, or behavioural health facility, anything to distance modern care from the asylum era. But changing the words does not automatically change the reality, and some of the problems that plagued Victorian asylums persist in different forms today. Here is an uncomfortable truth that we need to confront. When Victorian asylums began closing in the mid to late 20th century, the plan was to move toward community-based care. Instead of large institutions, mentally ill people would receive treatment in their communities, living independently with appropriate support. This was called deinstitutionalization, and it was supposed to be more humane, more respectful of patient autonomy, more effective. In some ways, it has been. Modern psychiatric medications, which were developed in the 1950s and have improved since, have made it possible for many people with serious mental illnesses to live outside institutions. Psychotherapy and other non-medical interventions have expanded treatment options. The stigma around mental illness has decreased, though not nearly enough. But deinstitutionalization also had unintended consequences that should sound familiar. Without adequate community support systems and funding, many people who would have been in asylums in the Victorian era ended up homeless or in prison. In fact, there is a quote from a 2009 article by Heather MacDonald in City Journal that makes a chilling observation. Jails have become society's primary mental institutions, though few have the funding or expertise to carry out the role properly. Think about that. We closed the asylums because they were inhumane warehouses that did not actually treat mental illness, and what replaced them, for many people, prisons, jails, institutions that are even less equipped to provide mental health care, even more focused on containment and control. We have not solved the problem. We have just moved it to a different building with a different name. This is not to say we should bring back Victorian asylums. Absolutely not. But it is to say that we have not yet figured out how to care for people with severe, chronic mental illness in a way that respects their dignity and actually helps them. The problems that the Victorians struggled with, how to balance safety and autonomy, how to fund adequate care, how to distinguish between people who need institutional support and people who just need to be left alone, we're still struggling with these same problems. The Victorian asylum also left us with persistent stereotypes about mental illness. The image of the raving lunatic who is dangerous and violent, the assumption that mental illness makes you incomprehensible, that there is no point trying to communicate with mad people because they are not rational. The idea that people with mental illnesses cannot make decisions for themselves and need to be controlled for their own good. All of these stereotypes were reinforced by asylum culture, and they linger stubbornly in public consciousness. These stereotypes do real harm. They make it harder for people to seek help when they need it, because admitting to mental health struggles feels like admitting to being one of those scary asylum inmates from history. They justify coercive treatment and reduced legal rights for people diagnosed with mental illnesses. They create fear and misunderstanding that isolate people who are already struggling. But there is also a more hopeful part of the Victorian asylum legacy, and it comes from the reformers who fought against the worst abuses. The work of people like William Tuke, who proved that kindness was possible. The investigations of people like Nellie Bly and Edward Wakefield, who forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. The testimony of patients who insisted that their experiences and perspectives mattered. All of these threads fed into modern movements for mental health reform and patients' rights. The concept of informed consent in medical treatment, for example, grew partly out of recognition of how asylum patients had been experimented on and subjected to procedures without their knowledge or agreement. The legal protections around involuntary commitment, which are still inadequate but better than they were, came from acknowledging the abuses of the Victorian system. The push for community-based care, even with its problems, represented a genuine attempt to learn from asylum failures, and the Bethlehem Museum of the Mind represents something important too, a willingness to remember and learn from difficult history rather than simply erasing it. The museum does not exist to make Bethlehem look good. It exists to preserve patient voices, to document institutional failures, to ensure that we do not forget what happened behind asylum walls. There are similar museums and archives around the world now, dedicated to preserving mental health history. In the United States, there is the Glore Psychiatric Museum in Missouri, which displays historical psychiatric treatments and artifacts. These are not always comfortable places to visit. Some of the exhibits are disturbing, but they are necessary. We need to know where we came from to understand where we are and where we should go. I think often about those unmarked asylum graveyards we mentioned, the thousands of people buried with just numbers instead of names. In recent years, some communities have undertaken projects to identify and memorialize those individuals, to give them back their names and recognize them as people who mattered. These projects involve painstaking research through old asylum records, trying to match burial numbers to admission records, finding families if any descendants still exist. It is slow, difficult work, but it is work of profound dignity. Because here is what the Victorian asylum system ultimately tried to do. It tried to make certain people disappear. It tried to remove them from sight, from memory, from the human community. The unmarked graves were the final expression of that impulse, and every time we recover a name, every time we tell a patient story, every time we acknowledge the humanity of people who are labelled insane and forgotten, we are fighting against that erasure. The physical buildings are crumbling. Many of them will be gone within a generation. But the stories, the lessons, the warning they represent, those need to be preserved. Because the impulse to hide suffering, to institutionalize problems rather than addressing them, to prioritize control over care, to dehumanize people who are different or difficult, that impulse did not die with the Victorian era. It lives on in new forms, and if we are not vigilant, if we do not learn from history, we will repeat it. So what do we take away from all of this? What does the Victorian asylum teach us about ourselves, about how we treat people on the margins of society, about the gap between our ideals and our actions? The answer to that question is complex and uncomfortable, but it is one we need to grapple with as we bring this journey through the shadows of Victorian mental health care to a close. Let us draw together all the threads of this story and see what pattern they form. Every ending holds within it the seeds of what comes next, and the story of Victorian asylums is no exception. The system did not collapse suddenly in some dramatic revolution. Instead, it faded slowly across decades, dying not because anyone defeated it, but because it became unsustainable under the weight of its own contradictions. Understanding how the asylum era ended and what replaced it helps us see both how far we have come and how far we still have to go. By the 1950s, the Victorian asylum system had reached its absolute peak in terms of numbers. Over 100 psychiatric hospitals existed in England and Wales alone, housing approximately 150,000 patients. These were massive institutions, some holding 3,000 or 4,000 people each. The buildings were aging, the costs were astronomical, and the public was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about whether this model of care actually worked. Then something changed, and that something was chemistry. In the early 1950s, pharmaceutical companies developed the first effective antipsychotic medications. A drug called chlorpromazine, marketed as Thorazine in the United States and Largactil in Britain, proved capable of reducing psychotic symptoms in patients with schizophrenia. For the first time in history, there was a treatment that actually worked for one of the most severe forms of mental illness. Let me be clear about what this meant. Chlorpromazine and the medications that followed were not cures. They did not make schizophrenia disappear, but they did make it possible for many people with psychotic disorders to function outside of institutions. Patients who had been locked in asylums for years, considered hopeless cases, were suddenly able to communicate more clearly, to control their symptoms enough to live somewhat independently. It was a genuine medical breakthrough. This pharmaceutical revolution gave policymakers an excuse to do something they had wanted to do for economic reasons: close the asylums. In 1961, the British government announced a plan to shut down many of the large psychiatric hospitals and move toward community-based care. The vision was humane and progressive. Instead of warehousing people in massive institutions, society would provide them with medication, outpatient treatment, and support services in their own communities. They would live in dignity, with autonomy, connected to families and society rather than hidden away. It was a beautiful vision, and it was catastrophically underfunded. The closures began in earnest in the 1980s and continued through the 1990s. One by one, the great Victorian asylums shut their doors. Patients were discharged, sometimes with careful planning and support, often without. Buildings were sold off, converted, demolished. The plan was that community mental health centres would provide ongoing care, that supported housing would give people places to live, that social services would help with the transition. But here is what actually happened in too many cases. Patients were released from asylums into communities that had no infrastructure to support them. The promised community mental health centres were either never built or were so underfunded that they could only serve a fraction of the need. Supported housing was scarce, social services were overwhelmed, and so, predictably, many people ended up on the streets. The homelessness crisis that exploded in Western countries in the 1980s and 1990s had many causes, but deinstitutionalization was certainly one of them. Studies have consistently shown that people with serious mental illnesses are vastly overrepresented among homeless populations. These are often the same people who, in an earlier era, would have been in asylums. We closed the institutions but did not create adequate alternatives, and the result was that vulnerable people fell through the cracks, or they ended up in prison. Remember that quote about jails becoming the new asylums? Here are some more specific numbers to illustrate this point. In the United States today, there are approximately 10 times more people with serious mental illnesses in jails and prisons than in psychiatric hospitals. The 3 largest psychiatric facilities in America are actually jails: Los Angeles County Jail, Rikers Island in New York, and Cook County Jail in Chicago. Let that sink in. The largest mental health institutions in the richest country in the world are prisons. Britain has similar problems, though perhaps not quite as extreme. The charity Rethink Mental Illness reports that people with mental health conditions are significantly overrepresented in the criminal justice system, often imprisoned for minor offences that were really symptoms of untreated illness. Once in prison, they receive minimal mental health care, and the experience of incarceration often makes their conditions worse. When they are released, they struggle to find housing, employment, and treatment, increasing the likelihood that they will end up back in prison. It is a cycle as vicious as anything in the Victorian asylum system. So we have to ask ourselves an uncomfortable question. Did we really reform mental health care, or did we just relocate it to different buildings? Did we learn from the failures of the asylum system, or did we repeat them in new forms? The answer is complicated. In some ways, modern mental health care is vastly superior to anything the Victorians could offer. We have medications that actually work for many conditions. We have psychotherapy techniques that are evidence-based and effective. We have legal protections for patient rights that, while imperfect, are better than what existed in the asylum era. We have reduced stigma and increased public awareness about mental health. These are genuine achievements that should not be dismissed. But in other ways, we have recreated some of the same problems. We still tend to hide away people with severe mental illnesses just in jails and homeless shelters instead of asylums. We still underfund mental health services compared to the actual need. We still struggle with the balance between protecting people's autonomy and ensuring they get treatment when they are too ill to seek it themselves. We still allow class and race to determine who gets good care and who gets warehoused. And we still, if we are honest, have a tendency to blame individuals for their mental illness, rather than acknowledging the social and biological factors beyond their control. Victorian doctors blamed moral weakness or reproductive dysfunction. Modern society sometimes blames personal choices or lack of willpower. The vocabulary has changed, but the underlying impulse to hold people responsible for their own suffering persists. There have been important successes, though, and we should acknowledge them. The concept of recovery, the idea that people with serious mental illnesses can live meaningful, fulfilling lives even if they are not cured, has transformed how we think about mental health. The disability rights movement has fought for inclusion and accommodation rather than institutionalization. Peer support programs where people with lived experience of mental illness help others have proven more effective in many cases than traditional medical models, and some countries have done a better job than others at creating genuine alternatives to institutionalization. In Trieste, Italy, they completely eliminated psychiatric hospitals and built a comprehensive community mental health system that is now studied as a model. It can be done. It requires political will, adequate funding, and a genuine commitment to seeing people with mental illnesses as full members of society rather than problems to be managed. But it is possible. The tragedy is how rare such successes are. Most places have half-heartedly implemented deinstitutionalization, closing the big institutions without creating adequate community supports. We wanted to save money, so we closed expensive hospitals. We did not want to spend money on comprehensive community services, so we did not build them. The result is that we saved money by letting people suffer in less visible ways. Let me tell you about something that gives me hope, though. There has been a movement in recent years to include people with lived experience of mental illness in designing and delivering mental health services. The old model was that doctors and administrators made all the decisions, and patients were passive recipients of care. But increasingly, organizations are recognizing that the people who've been through the system have valuable insights about what works and what does not. There are now peer support specialists who work in mental health settings, using their own experiences to connect with and help others. There are advisory boards made up of current and former patients who provide input on policies and programs. There are advocacy organizations led by people with mental health conditions fighting for better care and reduced stigma. This is the spirit of those Victorian asylum patients who wrote letters insisting that their voices mattered, who testified to investigators, who refused to be silent. That spirit lives on. We have also seen progress in reducing some of the most coercive practices. Forced treatment still exists, but there are more legal safeguards than there used to be. Mechanical restraints are used much less frequently, and when they are used, there is supposed to be documentation and oversight. Patients have more rights to refuse treatment, to access their own medical records, to have advocates. Again, these protections are not perfect and are not uniformly applied, but they represent genuine progress. The conversation about mental health has changed too. When I was growing up, people simply did not talk about mental illness. It was shameful, secret, something you hid. Now, celebrities and public figures speak openly about their struggles with depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. Social media, for all its problems, has created communities where people can share experiences and support each other. The stigma has not disappeared, but it has diminished, and that matters. But here is what keeps me up at night. All of this progress is fragile. It depends on continued political will and funding, and those things can disappear quickly. During economic downturns, mental health services are often the first things to be cut. When politicians want to look tough on crime, they push policies that criminalize mental illness. When communities fear change, they block the creation of supported housing in their neighborhoods. The same impulses that created Victorian asylums, the desire to hide problems away, the unwillingness to spend money on vulnerable populations, the fear of people who are different, are still with us. And there is another challenge on the horizon. As technology advances, as we learn more about the brain and genetics, there will be new forms of treatment and intervention. Some of these will be wonderful, but there is also potential for new forms of control and coercion. If we can identify genetic markers for mental illness, will that information be used to help people or to discriminate against them? If we develop more sophisticated medications or even technologies that directly alter brain function, who will decide when and how they are used? The ethical questions that the Victorians grappled with, questions about autonomy, about the boundary between helping and controlling, about who gets to define normal, will arise again in new forms. So what is the lesson we should take from the Victorian asylum story? I think it is this: good intentions are not enough. The reformers who created moral treatment had good intentions. The legislators who passed laws requiring counties to build asylums had good intentions. The doctors who performed gynecological surgeries genuinely believed they were helping. But good intentions without adequate resources, without genuine respect for patient autonomy, without constant vigilance against abuse, without willingness to listen to the people most affected, good intentions alone create horror as often as they create help. We need to do better. We need to fund mental health care adequately, not as an afterthought but as a priority. We need to listen to people with lived experience and include them in decision-making. We need to address the social conditions that contribute to mental illness: poverty, homelessness, trauma, discrimination. We need to create genuine alternatives to coercion and incarceration. We need to remember the lessons of history without being paralyzed by them. Because here is the thing about those Victorian asylum buildings that still stand. They are not just monuments to past failures. They are also reminders of human resilience. Thousands of people lived in those buildings and survived, some with their humanity and hope intact. Thousands of people fought for reform, even when reform seemed impossible. Thousands of people refused to be silenced or forgotten. Their stories are part of our inheritance, and we owe it to them to keep trying to get this right. As we come to the end of this long journey through the shadows of Victorian mental health care, I want to leave you with one final thought. One final reflection on what all of this means and why it matters. Because this is not just history. This is a mirror that shows us who we are and who we might become. The most important stories are the ones that make us uncomfortable, because discomfort means we're confronting truths we would rather avoid. And the Victorian asylum system forces us to confront some deeply uncomfortable truths about how societies treat people they find inconvenient, frightening, or simply different. This is not just a story about the past. This is a story about patterns that repeat, about choices we continue to make, about the gap between who we say we are and who we actually are when tested. Throughout this journey, we have seen the same dynamics play out again and again. We have seen how good intentions can curdle into cruelty when resources are inadequate and oversight is lacking. We have seen how diagnostic labels can be weaponized to control people who violate social norms. We have seen how class and gender determine who gets care and who gets warehoused. We have seen how easily suffering becomes invisible when it happens behind institutional walls. And we've seen how the people most affected by these systems, the patients themselves, are systematically denied voice and agency in their own treatment. Let me bring this full circle back to where we began, with Bedlam and its transformation from a place of sanctuary to a word meaning chaos itself. That linguistic evolution tells us something profound. When an institution meant to provide refuge becomes synonymous with madness and disorder, that is not just a failure of that particular institution. It is a failure of imagination, a failure to see the humanity in people whose minds work differently, a failure to commit the resources and attention necessary to actually help rather than simply contain. But here is what gives me hope. What I want you to take away from this story as you drift off to sleep tonight. The Victorian asylum system, for all its horrors, also produced extraordinary moments of resistance and reform. William Tuke looking at the brutality around him and deciding to try kindness instead. John Connolly abolishing restraints when everyone said it was impossible. Nellie Bly risking her own safety to expose the truth, Edward Wakefield refusing to look away from James Norris chained to a wall for 12 years, anonymous patients writing letter after letter insisting on their sanity, their humanity, their right to be heard. These people did not have the resources we have today. They did not have modern medications or psychological theories or brain imaging technology. They were working with limited tools and facing massive institutional resistance. But they tried anyway. They fought for reform anyway. They insisted on dignity and compassion anyway. And slowly, painfully, incrementally, they made things better. That is the pattern we need to remember and emulate. Change does not come from waiting until we have perfect solutions. Change comes from seeing suffering, acknowledging it, and doing whatever we can to reduce it, even when our efforts are imperfect. The reformers we've talked about did not solve mental illness, but they reduced suffering. They created moments of humanity in inhumane systems. They planted seeds that eventually grew into better approaches. Think about the trajectory we have traced. From Bedlam in 1247, where mentally ill people were simply locked away with no pretense of treatment, to the moral treatment revolution of the early 1800s, where at least some people tried to implement humane care. From the overcrowded warehouses of the late Victorian era back to community-based approaches in the late 20th century. From complete stigma and silence to growing openness and advocacy. The line is not straight. There have been terrible backslides. But the overall direction, across centuries, is toward greater recognition of the humanity and rights of people with mental illnesses. We stand at a particular moment in that long arc. We have tools the Victorians could not imagine, medications that work, therapies that help, technologies that might someday allow us to prevent or cure conditions that were once considered hopeless. But we also face familiar challenges: inadequate funding, persistent stigma, the criminalization of mental illness, the tendency to warehouse people out of sight. The question is what we will do with this moment. Will we learn from Victorian failures and commit the resources necessary to create genuine alternatives to incarceration and homelessness for people with mental illnesses? Will we listen to people with lived experience and include them in designing systems meant to help them? Will we address the social conditions, poverty, trauma, discrimination that contribute to mental distress? Will we resist the temptation to use new technologies for control rather than healing? These are not rhetorical questions. These are choices we're making right now through policy decisions and budget allocations and social attitudes. Let me tell you what I think about late at night. When I reflect on all the stories we've explored together, I think about Sarah Gardner, that domestic servant admitted to Bethlehem in 1857 with great mental depression, discharged later that same year. What happened to her after she left? Did she recover and build a good life, or did she struggle and end up back in the asylum? We will never know. Her story was not considered important enough to record in detail. I think about the thousands of people buried in unmarked graves on asylum grounds, their names lost, their lives reduced to nothing but a number in a ledger. I think about the women who were subjected to gynecological surgery in the name of curing their madness, who survived mutilated and still suffering from the conditions that had brought them to asylums in the first place. I think about the immigrants who could not speak English and were labelled insane simply because they could not communicate with their captors. But I also think about Henry Francis Harding and Walter Abraham Hay, whose doctors at Bethlehem treated them as intellectual equals and learned from their insights. I think about Richard Dadd creating beautiful art even while confined for murder he committed in the grip of delusion. I think about George Longmore voluntarily returning to Broadmoor because the outside world had no place for him, but at least choosing to return rather than being forced. I think about all the patients who formed friendships with each other, who helped each other survive, who maintained their humanity against a system designed to strip it away. And I think about Nellie Bly, who said after her investigation, "I left the insane ward with pleasure and regret, pleasure that I was once more able to enjoy the free breath of heaven, regret that I could not have brought with me some of the unfortunate women who lived and suffered with me, and who, I am convinced, are just as sane as I was and am now myself." That regret, that recognition that she was leaving people behind who did not deserve to be there, that awareness of her privilege in being able to leave when others could not, that is the emotional core we should carry with us. Because there are still people trapped in systems that do not serve them, still people whose voices are not being heard, still people who are suffering unnecessarily because we as a society have not committed to doing better. The Victorian asylum era ended, but the questions it raised have not been answered. How do we care for people with severe mental illnesses in ways that respect their autonomy and dignity? How do we balance individual rights with collective safety? How do we fund care adequately in a world of limited resources? How do we overcome stigma and fear? How do we ensure that the most vulnerable among us are not simply disappeared behind institutional walls, whether those walls surround asylums or prisons or homeless encampments? These questions do not have easy answers, but they demand our attention, our resources, and our compassion. They demand that we remember the lessons of history, both the failures and the successes. They demand that we listen to people with mental illnesses as experts on their own experience. They demand that we resist the temptation to hide problems away rather than addressing them. They demand that we keep trying to do better, even when better seems impossibly far away. So as you close your eyes tonight, I want you to remember the people we've met on this journey. The reformers and the patients, the abusers and the advocates, the silent and the vocal. Remember that they were all real people, living in complicated times, making choices with limited information and resources. Remember that some of those choices created immense suffering, and some created islands of humanity in seas of cruelty. Remember that we are still making similar choices, still struggling with similar questions, still capable of both great compassion and terrible indifference. The ghosts of the Victorian asylum system walk among us. Not literally. I do not believe in supernatural hauntings, but metaphorically, absolutely. Those ghosts appear in every person with mental illness who ends up in jail instead of getting treatment, in every family bankrupted by the cost of psychiatric care, in every stigmatizing comment about crazy people, in every policy decision that prioritizes budgets over human welfare. The past is not dead. It is not even past. But those ghosts do not have to haunt us forever. We can learn from them. We can do better than our ancestors did. We have more knowledge, more resources, more tools. What we need is the will to use them, the courage to face uncomfortable truths, and the compassion to see everyone, even people whose minds work very differently from our own, as fully human and deserving of dignity. The Victorian asylum system was a grand experiment in how to care for people with mental illnesses, and it ultimately failed. But it failed in ways that taught us important lessons, if we are willing to learn them. It showed us that institutions without adequate resources become warehouses, that medical authority without patient voice becomes tyranny, that good intentions without follow-through create suffering, that hiding problems does not solve them, that human beings are remarkably resilient but have limits to what they can endure. These lessons are not ancient history, they are urgent and immediate. Right now, somewhere, someone is trapped in a system that is not serving them. Someone is being denied voice and agency in their own care. Someone is suffering unnecessarily because we have not figured out how to do better. We owe it to them and to the thousands who suffered in Victorian asylums to keep trying. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the shadows of Victorian mental health care. Thank you for listening to these stories, some of which were difficult and disturbing. Thank you for caring about people whose names we will never know, whose suffering happened long ago but echoes into the present. The fact that you made it through this entire story suggests that you understand why it matters, why we cannot afford to forget. History is not just a collection of facts and dates. It is a conversation between past and present, a mirror that shows us who we were and who we are becoming. The Victorian asylum system shows us both the worst and the best of human nature, our capacity for cruelty and our capacity for compassion, our tendency to hide from difficult truths and our ability to face them when we must, our failures and our persistent hope that we can do better. As you drift off to sleep, know that the stories we have explored tonight are part of a larger human story about struggle and resilience, about suffering and survival, about the long, slow, imperfect journey toward treating each other with the dignity and compassion we all deserve. Rest well, and remember that every time we choose kindness over cruelty, transparency over secrecy, inclusion over exclusion, we are writing the next chapter of that story. I will be back soon with another journey into history, another exploration of the shadows and lights that have shaped our world. Until then, take care of yourself and each other, and if you or someone you know is struggling with mental health challenges, please reach out for help. We've come a long way from the Victorian asylum, and while our systems are still imperfect, help is available and you deserve support. Good night.